Tristan Bailey was a joyful and energetic 13-year-old girl living in St. John's, Florida. She was born on January 18, 2008, in St. John's, Florida. She grew up in a large and close-knit family that always supported her in her passions and endeavors. Her parents, Forrest and Stacy Bailey, were devoted and loving parents who raised their children in an atmosphere of care and mutual understanding. Tristan had 4 siblings, 2 older brothers, Tegan and Britton, an older sister, Alexis, and a younger sister, Sophia. The Bailey family was known for their strong bonds and close family ties. They often spent time together, participating in various family activities and supporting each other in all their pursuits. Tristan was especially close to her older sister, Alexis, who served as a role model for her. They shared many interests, and Alexis always supported her younger sister, inspiring her to achieve new heights. The entire family was deeply religious and actively involved in the life of their local community. Tristan Bailey was a cheerful and energetic girl. Her friends and family described her as a bright and kind person who always tried to help others and provide support in difficult moments. Tristan was a student at a local school and was actively involved in cheerleading, which was one of her main passions. She was known for her determination and discipline, always giving her all in everything she did. In her school community, Tristan stood out not only for her athletic achievements but also for her friendly nature. She easily made friends and maintained warm relationships with those around her. Her positive attitude and sincerity made her a favorite among her peers and teachers. May 9, 2021, began like any other Sunday. Tristan was spending time with her family. It was Mother's Day, and for the Bailey family, as for many others, it was a special day filled with warmth and togetherness. In the evening, Tristan met with friends, a typical activity for an active and sociable girl. However, she did not return home as expected later that evening. Her family became worried when they realized she was running late. Attempts to reach her by phone were unsuccessful, and her parents' anxiety grew. As night fell and Tristan still had not returned, the Bailey family decided to contact the police. Local authorities immediately launched a search, joining forces with volunteers and community members. They combed the surrounding area, reached out to neighbors and friends in search of information on where Tristan might have gone. The search continued throughout the night and into the next morning. It soon became clear that the situation was serious and that her disappearance was not accidental. By noon on May 10, 2021, after hours of searching, Tristan's body was discovered in a wooded area near her home. This news was shocking and tragic for her family and the community. A day that began as a typical celebration ended in an unspeakable tragedy that shook not only the Bailey family but the entire nation. In a statement, the sheriff carefully avoided revealing too many details, reassuring that the police were actively investigating and urging journalists to respect the privacy of the grieving family during this difficult time. However, it soon became known to the press that the case involved murder, a revelation that deeply shocked the local community. For residents of this prestigious neighborhood, crimes were rare, and such a brutal act of violence seemed unthinkable. Hundreds of people gathered, shocked by the event, to show support for Tristan's family and pay their respects. Dozens of local residents voluntarily provided the police with surveillance footage from cameras installed on their homes, hoping these materials would aid in the investigation. Everyone was consumed with one thought: who could commit such a heinous crime against an innocent child? As it turned out, these recordings indeed played a crucial role in the investigation, helping law enforcement track down the perpetrator. On the morning of May 9th, surveillance cameras near the Durban Crossing Sports Complex captured Tristan in the company of an unknown young man. At first glance, he appeared to be around her age. The boy was wearing shorts and a light-colored hoodie. Half an hour later, another camera, installed on Saddlestone Drive, again captured them walking toward a dead-end street that ended in a wooded area. Almost 2 hours later, the same camera captured the same young man, but this time Tristan was no longer with him. He was returning alone, carrying his shoes in his hands. This immediately caught the attention of the police, as it seemed extremely strange. The young man walked the same route, but in the opposite direction, raising even more questions from the investigators, as this unexpected action could be related to something much more serious. The police quickly identified the young man as 14-year-old Aiden Fucci, a classmate of Tristan's who lived just a few blocks away from her. Aiden Fucci was born and raised in St. John's, Florida, leading what appeared to be the ordinary life of a teenager. He attended the same school as Tristan and lived in the same neighborhood. Aiden grew up in a typical middle-class American family. He had friends and classmates with whom he socialized and spent time. At first glance, there was nothing that set him apart from his peers. Detectives arrived at Aiden Fucci's home intending to ask him a few questions. The main question was, why was he walking barefoot on a street so close to the location where Tristan's murder had taken place? Aiden explained that he had a blister on his foot and decided to walk home without shoes. However, this explanation did not satisfy the police, and they decided to search his home. After obtaining the necessary warrant, the police began their search and found the very clothes Aiden was seen wearing in the surveillance footage near Tristan. Some of these items had visible blood stains, which significantly heightened the suspicion of his involvement in the crime. The next day, on May 11th, the sheriff officially announced Aiden Fucci's arrest. Following his arrest, some of Aiden's acquaintances described him as a withdrawn and sometimes aggressive teenager. On social media and messaging platforms, he occasionally shared dark thoughts and interests related to violence. He had certain behavioral issues at school, although nothing that pointed to a propensity for serious crimes. After his arrest and the start of the investigation, it became known that Aiden had begun showing an unhealthy interest in the topic of violence and murder. Investigators found that he often discussed ideas related to killings with friends and even made drawings on the subject. This shocked the public and raised questions about what might have led the teenager to such a horrific act. His case became one of the most talked about in the country, sparking widespread public debate and raising concerns about teenage violence, mental health, and the influence of environment on young people's behavior. At that moment, the police kept many details of the investigation secret, and the public was in a state of deep shock. How could it be that a 14-year-old was involved in such a horrifying crime? Shortly after his arrest, Aiden committed an act that further shocked people. He posted a photo from the back of a police car on Snapchat. In the photo, he took a selfie and added a chilling caption that seemed especially disturbing in light of the events. "Hey guys, has anybody seen Tristan lately?" Aiden's post caused a wave of outrage and shock, as his message was perceived as mocking the tragic death of Tristan. For many residents of the area, this post became a kind of confirmation that Aiden was indeed involved in her death. Shortly thereafter, the police department reported that during his interrogation, Aiden repeatedly changed his statements, which only increased the investigators' suspicions and strengthened their belief in his involvement in the crime. Detectives also revealed horrifying details about Tristan's murder. The girl had been stabbed 114 times with a sharp object, clearly indicating that the crime was not only intentional but also meticulously planned. The killer had clearly prepared for the attack. Although the police were unable to find the murder weapon in Aiden's home, search teams soon discovered a knife submerged at the bottom of a local pond. Experts determined that this knife had been used in the murder, but due to its prolonged submersion in water, they were unable to retrieve fingerprints from the handle. To convincingly link Aiden to this heinous crime, the police needed more substantial evidence than just a suspicious camera recording or his strange behavior following the arrest. And soon, that evidence was found. For several days, experts worked tirelessly to carefully examine the items seized by the police from the suspect's home. DNA traces of Tristan Bailey were found on Aiden's shoes and shirt, which the police had confiscated during the search. These findings became key in the investigation. The investigators obtained irrefutable evidence linking Aiden to the crime scene and his victim. DNA analysis conclusively confirmed that the clothing found at Aiden's home bore traces of Tristan's blood, which became a decisive factor in establishing his guilt. Ultimately, the police gathered a compelling set of evidence sufficient to bring the case to trial. However, the investigators managed to obtain something even more significant, a partial confession from the teenager. Aiden confessed that he and Tristan were indeed walking together through the streets, and at some point, a conflict arose between them. According to him, during the argument, he pushed the girl, she fell, and hit her head on the ground. After that, Aiden claimed that he simply went home. However, this version of events seemed highly doubtful, given the numerous contradictions and the overwhelming evidence against him. Many believe that such a story might have been concocted by his lawyer in an attempt to reduce Aiden's culpability to a charge of manslaughter. However, with the weight of the evidence, this strategy appeared doomed to fail. Further investigation, during which the police interviewed Aiden's classmates and friends, led to the discovery of another shocking fact. This fact added even more grim shades to the overall picture and strengthened suspicions that Tristan's murder was not just a random incident, but a carefully planned act of cruelty. The teenager had repeatedly stated that he intended to take someone into the woods and kill them, but no one in his circle took these words seriously. Neither his friends nor acquaintances considered it necessary to report this to parents or the police, believing that Aiden was just joking. As it turned out later, he openly shared his dark intentions, but those around him did not take them seriously. Once the true nature of his threats became apparent, it was clear that these were not just casual words, but an expression of real intent. Given the public outcry and the wave of outrage sparked by the crime, the police and courts acted as swiftly and decisively as possible. Law enforcement understood the need to bring the case to a close as quickly as possible and ensure that justice was served for this horrific crime. The first court hearing for Aiden Fucci, held on May 11, 2021, was extremely tense and attracted significant public interest. At this hearing, Aiden faced the court on charges of murdering Tristan Bailey, a 13-year-old schoolgirl whose death shocked the entire state of Florida and sparked a wave of sympathy and anger across the country. Aiden Fucci participated in the hearing remotely via video link from a juvenile detention center. On the screen, he appeared confused and tense. The judge read out the charges against him, carefully explaining the seriousness of the crimes he was accused of. Aiden was charged with second-degree murder, which could later be upgraded to first-degree murder as more evidence emerged. During the hearing, the judge also discussed the issue of custody and the possibility of bail. However, given the severity of the crime and the risk to society, the court ruled that Aiden would remain in custody without the option of bail. Tristan Bailey's parents, who were present at the hearing, looked devastated and drained, but they were determined to seek justice for their daughter. Aiden's lawyers, in turn, insisted that their client needed a psychological evaluation to determine his mental state and ability to understand his actions at the time of the crime. The hearing was brief but set the tone for the upcoming trial. Aiden Fucci was sent back into custody, and the next hearing was scheduled for a later date, at which the court would review all the collected evidence and testimonies. A week after the trial began, Aiden's lawyer suddenly filed a motion to withdraw from the case without disclosing specific reasons for the decision. However, many speculated that the reason might have been quite clear: not every lawyer is capable of calmly defending someone accused of such a heinous crime. As a result, Aiden was assigned a public defender who continued his defense. Meanwhile, public outrage continued to grow. Residents of the town and people from other regions actively expressed their dissatisfaction by sending petitions to the prosecutor's office and the governor's office. People demanded that Aiden be tried as an adult and that the charge be upgraded to first-degree murder. Within days, the petition gathered over 700,000 signatures, demonstrating the scale of public outrage. Under public pressure and considering the nature of the crime, the court on May 27 ruled in favor of all points in the petition. On May 29, the court hearing for Aiden Fucci drew significant attention from both the press and the public. The proceedings took place in an atmosphere of tense anticipation, as the fate of the teenager accused of a brutal murder was at stake. Aiden appeared in court in person this time, rather than via video link as in the previous hearing. The courtroom was filled with journalists, relatives of Tristan Bailey, and people deeply concerned about the outcome of the case. Aiden appeared withdrawn and subdued, aware that he would have to answer for his actions before the court. Aiden Fuchi's lawyer attempted to portray him as a teenager under stress, emphasizing that his client was only 14 years old and that his mental state required careful consideration. The defense insisted on the need for an additional psychological evaluation to determine Aiden's condition at the time of the crime. However, the prosecution presented a detailed account of the crime, focusing on its brutality and premeditation. The prosecutor reminded the court of the 114 stab wounds inflicted on Tristan and emphasized that this was not a random attack but a carefully planned murder. He also mentioned the evidence found on Aiden's clothing, including the victim's DNA. The hearings lasted several hours, with each side striving to convince the court of their position. After the presentations were completed, the judge announced that the case would continue to be examined thoroughly before a final verdict was issued. During this time, Aiden was held in a special unit of an adult prison but isolated from other inmates. When a minor is tried as an adult, they are always held separately from other prisoners. This rule is designed to protect minors from potential threats posed by adult inmates. On June 4th, Aiden's lawyer filed a document in court declaring his client's innocence. This meant that the trial would have to prove his guilt, despite the public's belief in an inevitable guilty verdict. However, the following day, a more shocking development occurred. Aiden's mother was arrested for attempting to conceal evidence. On May 10th, the day Aiden was taken in for questioning, his mother, aware of the possible consequences, washed his clothes, which were later found to have bloodstains. The prosecutor, commenting on the situation to journalists, emphasized that he would seek a real prison sentence for her for tampering with evidence. Notably, Aiden's mother's actions were captured on surveillance cameras. The footage showed her washing the clothes, although the video quality did not allow for all details to be seen. As for Aiden himself, something strange happened. The court hearing for Aiden Fuchi on September 1st attracted significant attention as it was expected to shed light on the future course of the case. However, the hearing turned out to be unusual and raised many questions. Unexpectedly, the young man began talking about demons, incoherently asking where he was and what was happening around him. During the hearing, Aiden Fuchi behaved strangely, which was immediately noticed by those present in the courtroom and those following the proceedings in the news. Throughout the session, he appeared distracted, nervously glancing around several times, and seemed unable to focus on what was happening in the courtroom. At one point, he began muttering under his breath, which puzzled those in attendance. The strangest moment came when Aiden suddenly started laughing loudly, despite the seriousness of the situation. His behavior was clearly out of the ordinary and was noticed by both the lawyers and the judge. The judge issued a warning, after which Fuchi's lawyer attempted to explain his behavior as nervous tension and emotional instability. These events raised doubts about the teenager's mental state and whether he fully understood the seriousness of his situation. The defense emphasized that Aiden required additional psychological evaluation to determine his mental state at the time of the crime and during the court sessions. His behavior seemed too abrupt and unnatural, leading many to suspect that he might be feigning mental instability as a manipulative tactic. The hearing was postponed to allow for a more detailed assessment of Fuchi's mental state, adding uncertainty to the future of the trial. According to reports from journalists, a court psychologist who was not directly involved in Aiden's case expressed his opinion about Aiden's behavior. The specialist noted that, in his observation, the suspect's behavior did not appear to be feigned. Additional circumstances only heightened concern. A notebook with drawings of satanic runes was found in Aiden's cell, and his girlfriend told investigators that he had repeatedly complained of hearing voices in his head that allegedly urged him to kill someone. All of this appeared very suspicious. Questions arose because Aiden had behaved normally for several months after his arrest, but suddenly, at one point, he began to show complete disorientation, forgetting where he was, and started talking about demons. This sudden change in behavior raises the question of whether he is trying to avoid prison by these means. Let's not forget his mocking selfie taken in the police car, where he openly taunted Tristan's death. Such behavior could only be displayed by a cold-blooded person devoid of any compassion. Or perhaps it was the voices in his head that compelled him to make that post. Of course, he was assigned a medical examination, which ultimately provided a conclusion about his mental state. On October 28th, the trial of Aiden Fucci marked another significant stage in this high-profile case. The hearing took place in a tense atmosphere as the public and media closely followed every twist and turn of the process. Aiden, who was 15 years old at the time, appeared in court again, where the results of the psychological evaluation in the future course of the case were discussed. Representatives of both the prosecution and defense were present in the courtroom, along with Tristan Bailey's parents, who watched the proceedings with pain in their eyes. The psychological evaluation, conducted earlier, revealed that Aiden was sane and fully aware of his actions at the time of the crime. This conclusion was a blow to the defense, which had been attempting to argue the possibility of a mental disorder in the teenager. The hearing also reviewed additional evidence gathered during the investigation. Prosecutors presented new facts confirming that the murder was premeditated and committed with extreme cruelty. In particular, recordings from his prison cell, satanic symbols found in his notebook, and witness testimonies that Aiden had previously spoken about his dark thoughts and desire to kill someone were all examined. The defense, in turn, continued to insist that Aiden needed further psychological help and that his age and emotional state should be considered in sentencing. The hearing lasted several hours, with tension in the courtroom escalating with each statement. Eventually, the judge decided to continue the case, scheduling the next hearing date. The trial of Aiden Fucci concluded with a verdict in March 2023. Aiden Fucci was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The court considered the extreme cruelty with which the crime was committed, as well as the fact that it was premeditated. The judge emphasized that although Aiden was a teenager at the time of the crime, his actions demonstrated such a high degree of brutality that the maximum sentence was deemed justified. The court's decision was an important step in the case of Tristan Bailey and serves as a reminder of the severe consequences of violence, even when committed by young people. The court also rejected any attempts by the defense to mitigate the sentence based on Aiden's age or possible mental health issues, insisting that none of these factors could excuse the crime he committed. Aiden Fucci is not eligible for an appeal or parole, meaning he will remain in prison for the rest of his life.
Joyce McLean was born on September 4, 1963. When she was young, her family moved to a tiny town called Millmarket, located almost on the edge of the United States. From an early age, she had a passion for music. The girl quickly mastered several instruments, but her favorite was the saxophone. She loved to compose her own compositions and was a member of the school music group. In addition, she was a member of the cheerleading team, played soccer, and in general, was a very active participant in school life. At the end of the summer vacation in 1980, Joyce was preparing for her approaching age of 17. She had only recently received her driver's license, and she planned to go to the lakeshore with her friends and relatives to celebrate her birthday. She was even going to invite a local musical group to celebrate her birthday. Joyce had 2 more grades to finish, after which she planned to go to college. The girl was preparing for this in advance, so she studied only with honors, as well as earning various sports and musical achievements. On August 8th, she and her friends spent the day at the lake, after which she decided to go for a run. Joyce loved sports, but running was not her favorite activity. In spite of that, she was going to play in high school soccer games during the new school year, and she made every effort to keep herself in shape. The girl went out for a run at about 7:30 p.m. Normally, she would run with her friend, but she was busy that night. Joyce had a standard route. She would do a few laps on the road that went around her tiny town. It usually took about an hour, but that night, the girl never made it home. Several hours had passed since Joyce had left, and her mother was beginning to get seriously worried. The girl always let her parents know where she was going, and if she had gone for a walk with friends after her run, her parents would have already known about it. Her mother decided to go looking for her and drove around town in her car. She asked around all the neighbors who came her way, but no one had seen Joyce. Considering the vast majority of the people in this small town knew each other, a few more people joined the search. Night was approaching, and the girl was still nowhere to be found. Then the concerned parents decided to call the police. Local officers immediately joined the search, and in the hours that followed, more and more citizens took to the streets. They combed the route Joyce was running, as well as the area behind the school. Unfortunately, there was no sign of Joyce. With each passing hour, panic increased, and there was little hope of finding Joyce alive and unharmed. It was the middle of the night. The police had completely ruled out the possibility she might have gone out with some friends. The problem was that everyone she knew was at home and later joined the search. Joyce's parents simply couldn't imagine their daughter deciding to go out alone until very late at night. They were unable to locate her, and the search dragged on for 2 days. During that time, police officers, along with residents, continued to explore the area until they finally made the heartbreaking discovery on August 10th. Joyce's body was found just 60 yards from the school playgrounds, not far from the trees. The girl was lying on the ground. Virtually all of her clothes were missing, and her hands were tied behind her back with a piece of blue cloth. The police immediately realized that the victim had been hit hard in the head, but a more detailed analysis was to be done by a medical expert. After examining the body, they concluded that the girl had received multiple blows to the head and that her death occurred on the evening of the same day she disappeared. Despite the almost total lack of clothing, the unknown perpetrator did not abuse her. Unfortunately, no other information could be obtained. There were no foreign DNA samples on the body, and even in the early 1980s, the technology was only in its infancy. The first person in history to be convicted thanks to DNA testing was not arrested until 1987. So the police were forced with a complex investigation with a minimal set of clues. Shortly after the discovery of the body, officers discovered Joyce's clothes, but that did not bring them any closer to a solution either. News of the brutal murder quickly spread through the town, plunging it into a very grim state. As is usually the case, the inhabitants of such tiny towns in the middle of nowhere had never encountered a murder. Adding to the anxiety was the fact that the killer was still out there. His identity remained unknown. Given the complete lack of evidence, several theories swept through the town. The most popular was that Joyce's body had been found near a place where less fortunate youths congregated. They often drank alcohol there at night and also took illegal substances. People thought that a group of such tipsy guys might have molested Joyce and things got out of hand. The police even checked with locals who regularly spent time in those companies, but they were unable to establish their involvement. Another theory was that the killer might have been a man who came for seasonal work. Hundreds of people came to this area on a regular basis since there were not enough local people to fill all the jobs. But even here, the police could not find any evidence. Some even began to suspect the volunteer who discovered Joyce's body. The fact was that he had spent most of his time surveying the area in tandem with another volunteer. On the morning of the last day, however, he went out to search alone. Because of this, there was a theory that he was involved. But even here, the police could not confirm his guilt. There was another version. It turned out that the same night Joyce disappeared, there had been a serious accident not far from the city. A 19-year-old local resident had snuck into a garage and stolen a gas tanker before crashing into another vehicle. He sustained serious head injuries and slipped into a coma for 9 days, making it impossible for the police to question him, and when he woke up, he pleaded not guilty. The investigators didn't know what to do next. They had no evidence or witnesses. As a result, the case went into a long drawer for years, during which time the police were unable to get any closer to a clue. 8 years later, Joyce's relatives created a petition calling for coverage of their daughter's murder on a national unsolved crime show. This would get the word out to viewers across America and draw the attention of potential witnesses. There is always the possibility that someone heard or saw something, but for some reason did not report it to the police. The petition gathered 6,000 signatures, and the authors of the program agreed to do their own story.
It was broadcasted in 1989, and the police did indeed receive a lot of appeals, but all of the collected information turned out to be either erroneous or outright false. Unfortunately, this happens in almost every well-known case. People either make mistakes or simply lie and fabricate non-existent facts, forcing the police to waste time and resources on checks. The case stalled for several more years, but all the while Joyce's mother continued to fight for the truth. In the mid-2000s, she decided that new technology and techniques in forensics could help uncover evidence that had been missed in the 1980s. To do so, experts needed to exhume the victim's body, but there were challenges. Initially, authorities denied the mother's request for an exhumation. They believed that in almost 3 decades, any possible evidence simply had not been preserved, but the woman continued to insist. And in 2007, she managed to move the issue from the dead point. The medical expert Peter Cummings of Massachusetts contributed greatly to this effort. He was born in East Millnocket and was only 5 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Despite such a young age, he remembered well the horror into which his town had been plunged. Peter admitted that it was these events that guided him into the field of forensics and medicine. When he learned that the authorities had rejected Joyce's mother's petition for an exhumation, he contacted her and asked her not to abandon the idea. Peter believed that the remains might have been preserved enough to try to extract evidence from them. He also contacted one of the leading forensic experts in the United States, and he took an interest in the case. Joyce's mother decided to take the initiative and organize an independent examination. The exhumation required about $20,000 for their own funds, which the family did not have, but they had the support of concerned people who, after so many years, still remembered the case. With their help, the family quickly raised the necessary amount, and the exhumation took place in 2008. To the surprise of many, experts did unearth some important evidence, but at the time, they kept this information secret. Investigators only said that the discovery would not be followed by an immediate arrest, but the police immediately reopened the case. A few months later, it was reported that unidentified people had desecrated Joyce's grave. The police said they did not know if it had anything to do with the murder investigation. The next major twist came a year later in 2009, and that moment may have been pivotal as law enforcement announced a prime suspect for the first time in 29 years. Let's take it back to 1980. As we recall, a few hours after Joyce's murder, a local man stole a gasoline truck and got into a serious accident, causing him to fall into a coma. That man was 19-year-old Scott Fournier, and in 2009, he was put on the bench for possession of illegal material with minors. It seemed like the two cases were unrelated, except after the sentencing, the judge suddenly announced Scott as a person of interest in the Joyce McLean murder case, urging the man to confess to what he had done. This news greatly surprised Joyce's relatives. They were well acquainted with Scott and knew that the police were considering him as a suspect because of that accident. But why had a judge officially declared him a person of interest after a long 29 years? The lead detective in the case declined to comment on the situation. He only said that they had made significant progress since the exhumation and that the investigation was well underway. Scott was sentenced to 6.5 years in prison for possession of banned material. It was a minimal sentence despite having a criminal history. He was tried in 1979, 1980, and 1984 for theft, but all of those crimes occurred too long ago to affect the amount of time in the current case. He also came onto the police radar in 2001 when his 6-year-old daughter complained that he was molesting her. Although law enforcement believed the girl, the crime could not be proven, and Scott was not punished. All of the above already seems enough for a man to be seriously considered for the role of Joyce's killer. But as it turns out, that's just the tip of it, and gets much scarier from there. Unfortunately, the case dragged on for several more years while the man was in prison. Investigators kept the evidence they had gathered under wraps and interviewed possible witnesses. In 2015, they assembled a team of 10 men and again surveyed the area where Joyce's body had been found. At the end of the search, They gave no details, but a year later, everything fell into place. On March 4, 2016, police officially announced the arrest of the suspect. Scott Fournier, who had only recently been released from prison, was taken into custody and charged with the murder of Joyce McLean. Scott, who was already 55 years old at the time, refused to plead guilty, and the case went to trial. He spent nearly 2 years in jail awaiting his first hearing because he didn't have $300,000 for bail. The trial didn't begin until 2018, and the public finally learned something really strange. It turned out that Scott had repeatedly confessed to killing Joyce just weeks after the fact. On one occasion, he cried and confessed to his mother and sister that he had killed Joyce. On other occasions, he told a local priest, an acquaintance of a married couple, and a co-worker of his. Some of these confessions did not reach the police until years later, but some became known almost immediately. Scott was questioned, but he began to deny his guilt. The guy referred to the head injury he sustained in the accident. According to him, he really thought he killed Joyce, but now believes that in reality it never happened. He was questioned a total of 27 times, and Scott kept changing his story. At first, he told the police that he killed Joyce by stabbing her several times with a glass insulator from a power line that was lying nearby. The girl was indeed killed right under the power line. Scott further stated that he tied her hands, abused her, and fled. The police were confused by one fact in this story. Firstly, they were unable to identify the exact murder weapon, even though a glass insulator was found near the body. Second, Joyce had not been abused, as the medical examiner's report attested, but otherwise his story was very close to the truth. In the following interrogations, he stated that he had killed Joyce in the company of other guys. Then he said he had just watched them attack her. He then changed his statement again and said that these guys forced him to participate in the crime. There were many stories like this, and during the investigation phase, the detectives just got confused. They had no hard evidence against Scott, and his story changed every time they questioned him. For this reason, he was not arrested all these years. It was only in time that they managed to gather enough evidence to bring the case to trial. 2 witnesses helped in this, a priest and a colleague of Scott's, who both heard him confess. The colleague asked the guy how he got away with it. Scott replied that he had simply filled the police with false accounts of other people's involvement and that it threw them off the scent. A colleague reported the conversation to his superiors, but not to the police. Apparently, they never passed the information on to law enforcement. He admitted to the priest that he did not abuse Joyce because she was on her period at the time, and that was a key factor. The police never divulged this information, although they became aware of it after examining the girl's body. It turns out that Scott simply could not have known such details unless he himself was the killer. Scott's attorneys insisted that all the evidence was circumstantial. They wrote off their client's confession to the head injuries sustained in the accident. They also cited the fact that the police did not arrest the man immediately after he first confessed to the murder. In addition, the attorneys rebuked the court for refusing to consider other suspects. For example, they tried to pin the blame on the man who discovered Joyce's body, Peter Larley. That morning, he was to go in search of the girl, paired with another volunteer. They had arranged to meet at 6 a.m., but Peter never showed up. Later, the volunteer learned that he had gone out early and found the body. But there's an odd point here, too. This volunteer's sister lived next door to Peter, and on the morning of that day, she saw the man leave the house at dawn. According to the woman, he had a large gym bag in his hands, and when he returned home after finding the body, he looked happy and smiling. This story seems dubious, if only for the reason that the volunteer did not report all of this to the police until 16 years after the murder. That already seems strange, and it is impossible to verify the authenticity of his words. Unfortunately, Peter Larley died of a heart attack just 2 days before Scott's arrest. For this reason, no one will ever know why he came out earlier, but the police said that there is no evidence that he was involved in the murder. The prosecution denied all the arguments of the lawyers. They assured him that the police had looked at all possible suspects and had not been able to find even a hint of their involvement. Scott, on the other hand, gave many reasons for suspicion. Even his stepfather told police early in the investigation that he suspected Scott of murder. According to him, A few days before the incident, the boy said he planned to start running in the evenings. He also mentioned that he felt sympathy for Joyce. Moreover, when Scott first confessed to the murder, he was asked to show where he had attacked Joyce. The boy led investigators to the exact spot where the body was found. They cited several other witnesses to corroborate the theory that he was involved. On the evening of Joyce's murder, at about 9 p.m., the couple saw Scott run by the scene of Joyce's murder with a bottle of liquor in his hands. Except, according to them, an unknown young man was running beside him. They didn't know at the time that's where the girl's body would be found, but they'd later reported it to the police. An hour and a half earlier, 2 local teenagers had also seen Scott and an unidentified young male running through that area. The trial lasted just over 2 weeks, and the final verdict was handed down on February 5, 2018. Scott was found guilty of Joyce's murder, sentencing him to 45 years in prison. At the time, the man was 57 years old, a sentence that virtually guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. In 2019, Scott's attorneys appealed, which helped them schedule a new hearing. The court, however, did not change the original sentence. According to the judge, the evidence against the perpetrator was exhaustive, and all the arguments of the defense had no weight. Joyce's relatives lifted from their shoulders the heavy weight of ignorance that had been with them for 38 years. All that time, they had fought for the truth, and it was her mother who contributed the most. This woman dedicated her life to getting justice. Eventually, she went even further and helped pass a law that enabled the authorities to start allocating substantial funds for the creation of unsolved homicide squads. One obscure point remains in the whole story. Who was the other guy seen by witnesses? Scott's involvement here is almost obvious. He knew so many details that the police never disclosed publicly. It just can't be written off as conjecture. But what about the 2 groups of witnesses who told the police the same thing? Could it be that Scott committed this crime in company with some other person? This point is also questionable. After Joyce was killed, Scott stole a gasoline truck and had an accident, but he was the only one in the car. Where did his supposed partner go? Is it possible that they separated immediately after the murder? And yet, the version of the second killer seems dubious. Lisa Kimmel was born July 18, 1969, in the small American town of Covington, Tennessee. Soon her parents had 2 more daughters, and in 1972, the family moved to a town called Billings. From an early age, the girl was distinguished by her independence and determination. She helped her parents take care of their younger sisters and also worked part-time at a local restaurant. Thanks to this, she earned a new Honda CRX for herself even before she graduated from high school. The young woman also finished her license plate with the inscription Little Miss, as she was often called by her parents and sisters, and these plates would play a significant role in the whole story. After graduating from high school in 1987, Lisa decided to continue working at the restaurant despite her parents' objections. They wanted their daughter to go to college, but the young woman planned to pursue a career in her chosen direction. They eventually agreed that Lisa would work for a year and still consider going to college. The young woman worked at a large chain restaurant, Arby's, along with her mother, who was the regional manager there. And soon after graduation, Lisa was offered a management position herself, but already in another city. She was to go to the suburbs of Denver, about 900 kilometers from home, and manage a restaurant there. For the 18-year-old young woman who had just graduated from high school, it was a serious challenge, but Lisa accepted without a shadow of a doubt. In addition, her mother frequently traveled to Denver for work, and they saw each other almost every week. Sometimes the young woman herself drove to her family's house in Billings. The restaurant where Lisa worked was in a town called Aurora. She quickly settled into her new place, rented an apartment, and was generally excited about her new life. She made new friends and a few months later started dating a guy named Ed. He often went to Aurora but lived 800 miles away. On Friday, March 25, 1988, Lisa was getting ready with anticipation for the weekend she had big plans for. She was going to go to Billings and take her boyfriend with her to finally introduce him to her family. He lived in Cody, Wyoming, which was along her route. Lisa planned to pick him up and drive on with him from there. She left Aurora at about 4 p.m. She had about 7 hours to drive to the boyfriend's house. After driving about 400 kilometers, Lisa reached Douglas, Wyoming. Apparently, she was in a big hurry because at 9 p.m. a police officer stopped her car for speeding. According to his radar readings, Lisa was going about 140 kilometers per hour. He gave her a $120 fine, which state law required her to give to the officer on the spot. Lisa didn't have that amount with her, so the police officer suggested she withdraw the money from the nearest ATM near the road. They got there, but the terminal did not support Lisa's bank card. According to the rules, the police officer had to detain the offender, who was unable to pay the fine. But the man agreed to let Lisa go on the condition that she send the check to the local police department. The young woman got into her car and drove on. It was about a 4-hour drive from Douglas to her boyfriend's house. Woman, he never waited for her that night, and toward morning, Ed fell asleep. When he woke up at about 7 a.m., Lisa was still gone. In those days, there were no cell phones, so he had no way to contact her. Instead, the guy started calling the police departments of the 2 states. He gave them information about Lisa and her car, wondering if anything had happened. The police accepted the information, but would not file a missing persons case. The reason for this was the fact that Lisa was 18 years old and too little time had passed since she disappeared. The guy waited a few more hours and then started calling mutual friends. None of them knew where she was missing. He also called Lisa's boss and then tried to contact her parents, but they were not at home. They came back hours later and their phone was ringing off the hook. Several people tried to contact them at once to see if they had heard from their daughter. At first, the parents thought Lisa had just been delayed and was still on the road. She had traveled this route many times before, and it was hard to imagine that anything could have happened to her, but time passed and she was still gone. By then, her parents had called Ed and called him over to their house. The first meeting that Lisa had planned for so long happened without her and under such unsettling circumstances. 2 days passed. The young woman was still unreachable, and the police refused to start looking for her. According to the law, it was necessary to wait 72 hours before filing a missing person report. The parents decided not to sit idly by and start searching on their own. Lisa's father hired a light aircraft pilot to fly along the road where the young woman was supposed to be. He hoped this would help locate her car, but the search was unsuccessful. The father also drove part of that route in his car, but he was unable to find any sign of Lisa. The family did not stop there. The young woman's parents contacted a private investigator they knew who had previously worked for the police. Thanks to his connections, he was able to convince the local police department to take an early missing person report. Unfortunately, they could not find any solid leads. The police immediately determined that their patrol officer had stopped Lisa the night she disappeared, but her fate remained unknown. Only one thing was clear. The young woman had disappeared with the car somewhere between Douglas and the town of Cody. The police had searched the area along that route, but there is one significant problem. We are talking about hundreds of miles of fields, woods, and mountains. It took months of work and thousands of people to cover the entire area. For this reason, the search on the ground made little or no progress. 8 days passed. On the morning of April 2nd, a man called the police. He said he was fishing in a river near Casper, Wyoming. At one point, he noticed a human body lying face down in the water. Shortly before, the fisherman had heard on the radio that police were looking for a missing young woman, so he immediately thought it was her. Detectives arrived on the scene, took the body out of the water, and determined that the deceased was indeed Lisa. Medical experts have studied the body and came to a terrible discovery. They determined that the young woman died about 6 days after her disappearance. That is, Lisa died just 2 days before the discovery, and detectives had to figure out where she was all this time. That said, police initially thought the death occurred about 5 hours after she disappeared, which later led to confusion. Doctors also determined that the young woman had been abused while alive, and on her body they found several stab wounds and contusions. Apparently, she had been thrown into the water from a bridge while she was unconscious. Police later confirmed this version, finding blood on the bridge. Finally, medical experts extracted biological material from the young woman's body, which turned out to be a sample of male semen and apparently belonged to the killer. It was sent to a lab, but in those years, the tools to study DNA were very scarce. The local lab simply did not have the necessary resources to extract the profile of the perpetrator. Detectives concluded that the killer was most likely a local resident who lived near the river. This was evidenced by the fact that the bridge from which the young woman had been thrown was located in a remote wilderness area. It had not been used for a long time, and in order to access it, one had to turn from the main road to a country road and then drive some distance. Based on that, the police assumed that only someone who knew the area well could have chosen this bridge for a body dump. Detectives focused on finding Lisa's car. They assumed that the killer had driven it somewhere and there might be additional clues in it. But the car seemed to have fallen under the ground and they could not find it. Investigators actively shared information about the case with the public, hoping that someone had useful information. The case was also widely televised, and a lot of people did come forward. But here's something strange started to happen. In all, the police received more than 100 calls. People said they had seen a Honda CRX with Little Miss plates, as well as Lisa herself. Only these testimonies came from different states and even Canada. A few appeals seemed more convincing to the police. 5 different witnesses claimed to have seen the very car with the license plate Little Miss, driven by a young woman who closely resembled Lisa. Except this was a few days after her disappearance on March 26th and 27th. It's hard to imagine that the young woman stayed in the Casper area for several days for whatever reason and didn't see fit to call her relatives. Moreover, she had to go to work on Monday, and she would never have missed it. One witness stated that there was a man sitting in the car with Lisa, but the police were unable to confirm this information. Based on all the inquiries, the detectives compiled 7 portraits of the alleged men seen near Lisa, but none of them were of any help to the investigation. The descriptions were too different to isolate any one man. The police questioned the words of all these witnesses. They conceded that the killer might have driven Lisa's car, but there was no logical explanation that she herself could have driven around the area all weekend without calling her parents from any nearby payphone. Apparently, one of the witnesses actually saw the killer drive Lisa's car to hide it, and the rest of the testimony is either erroneous or outright false. Police later determined that there were several similar car models registered in that area, and witnesses may well have seen them. During the investigation, detectives identified several suspects, but they all turned out not to have been involved in the case. 6 months later, police had a new tip. Someone pinned an envelope to Lisa's grave with a note. In it, on behalf of a man, it was written that he missed Lisa and called her death his painful loss. The letter was signed by Stringfellow Hawk, a character from a popular television series at the time. At first glance, there didn't seem to be anything suspicious about the note, but all of Lisa's relatives and acquaintances denied having anything to do with the letter. The detectives therefore assumed that it might have been left by the killer. In March 1989, exactly 1 year after Lisa's disappearance, the case was reported on a popular television program devoted to unsolved crimes. Given that it was watched by millions of viewers across the country, the police received numerous tip-off calls. It took months and extra manpower for local detectives to verify them. Lisa's parents felt that the local police department could not handle the volume of tips and leads that came in after the program aired. For this reason, they wanted the FBI to handle their daughter's murder. But Sheriff Ron Ketchum was very negative about the idea and said he had no intention of giving the case up. In spite of that, a year later, Lisa's parents still got federal investigators involved in the case, with the support of higher authorities. They became involved in the investigation and wanted to work with the sheriff, but he would not cooperate or even return their calls. Thanks to the FBI's involvement, the detectives were now able to examine a DNA sample from the victim's body at a federal lab. It was compared to Lisa's boyfriend's sample, and they did not match. He had not been considered a suspect before, but the investigators decided to be 100% sure. Next, they decided to check the patrolman who had stopped Lisa shortly before she disappeared. He had a recording of a conversation with the young woman that showed him saying goodbye to her, but detectives conceded that he might have found Lisa and attacked her later. The officer immediately agreed to provide his DNA sample, and it did not match the killer's. The next unexpected tip came after a local radio station aired a program about Lisa's murder. The police were contacted by a witness who stated that he had seen the young woman stop in the road of Sheriff Ron Ketchum on the day she disappeared. And there were some really suspicious moments here. The sheriff himself never said he stopped Lisa that night. He also actively opposed the FBI's involvement in the case, and just like that, exactly 2 years after Lisa's murder, a man quit the force and tried to take his own life. He was able to be recuperated and was undergoing psychological treatment at the time. Investigators came to him with questions, but Ron pleaded not guilty and refused to provide a DNA sample. This all looked suspicious, and the investigators began to seriously consider him as a suspect. But a few months later, when they were ready to apply for a court order for a DNA sample, the man did provide one himself, and it did not match the killer's sample. It's not entirely clear why the sheriff was acting so strangely if he had nothing to do with Lisa's murder. His colleagues pointed out that he had always been a complicated and closed person who had been through Vietnam, so he was behaving this way even before the young woman's disappearance. At this point, the police ran out of serious leads. In 1992, they published more data on the case in the hope that they would be able to find new witnesses. According to the main version of the investigation, there could have been several perpetrators. Most likely, one man kidnapped and killed Lisa, but someone helped him get rid of the car. Investigators also believed that the young woman was kidnapped during a traffic stop at a gas station or somewhere else. They ruled out the option of Lisa picking up a hitchhiker because the young woman was very cautious. Shortly before these events, Lisa's car stalled on the road and another driver stopped to help her. The young woman did not get out of the car and only lowered her window slightly to talk to him because she understood the potential risk. The police never managed to get any new leads, and the case went cold for another 10 years. It wasn't until July 2002 that a long-awaited breakthrough awaited them. The local police department reopened the investigation, and the first thing they did was put the killer's DNA sample into the FBI database. It didn't yet exist in the late 80s, and it took many years for it to start being used en masse across the country. When they did add a sample from Lisa's body there, investigators immediately got a match. The sample belonged to a 59-year-old man named Dale Wayne Eaton, who was in prison at the time. He had been arrested in 1997 for armed assault on a family. A young couple and their child were driving through the Wyoming wilderness when their car stalled. Dale drove by and stopped to help. He inspected the car and said there was no way to fix it on the spot, so he offered the family a ride to the nearest service station, which supposedly belonged to his brother. They agreed and got into his van, and a few miles later, Dale said he was tired and needed to sleep. He asked the woman to drive, and he got into the back of a van himself. When the car moved, he pulled out his rifle and ordered the woman to pull off onto a country road.
but the woman twisted the wheel so hard that Dale lost his balance and dropped his weapon. They got out of the car and the perpetrator pulled out a knife. But at that moment, the father of the family grabbed the rifle and hit Dale with the buttstock. The family then got into his van and drove to the nearest police station. Detectives drove to the scene, located Dale nearby, and arrested him. During his trial, he was found to have a number of mental disabilities, so instead of going to jail, they sent him to a closed rehabilitation facility. The idea of the authorities was that he would spend several years there, during which time he would be held to get on with his life, learn a profession, and so on. However, he escaped from there after a few months, for which he was arrested and sent to prison for 5 years. The important thing here is that before he was incarcerated, a DNA sample was taken from Dale and entered into the FBI database. It is because of this that investigators in the Lisa case finally got a match. He was 43 years old at the time of Lisa's murder and lived near that area. Upon examining Dale's background, law enforcement discovered an impressive list of offenses behind him. He committed his first serious crime at the age of 16. Dale sold a woman some watermelon and offered to help carry them home. When they entered the premises, the woman examined the watermelons and saw that they were rotten.
She refused to pay for them, and after a brief argument, Dale stabbed her and then fled. The guy was arrested the next day, and the court sent him to compulsory treatment. He was diagnosed with a number of moderate mental disorders. After receiving treatment, he kept changing jobs because he couldn't get a foothold in any job. Sometime later, he married and the couple had 3 children. The marriage was not happy. The couple quarreled constantly and divorced after 15 years. In 1996, he moved to a town called Moneta, just an hour away from Casper. There, his in-laws had several unfinished buildings and a bus converted to housing on the property. It was there that Dale settled in. There were no living conditions in that bus except for a small bed. Once in a while, he would go to a neighbor's house to take a shower. As a result, there was an inveterate repeat offender before the investigation whose DNA was found on Lisa's body, but they wanted more evidence before they could charge him. Officers arrived at the precinct where he lived before his arrest. Several neighbors lived a short distance away, and one of them told the detectives an interesting story. According to him, around the same time Lisa disappeared, Dale dug a huge hole on his property. He said he was going to put in a septic tank, but that never happened. Investigators dug up the lot and found what they had already guessed. Lisa's car with Little Miss plates was there. With all this in hand, the police set about gathering all the data they needed to build a win-win case against Dale, since they had more than enough time. While in prison, the man had killed his cellmate, so it would be a while before he got out. In April 2003, he was finally charged with the murder of Lisa Kimmel. The man refused to plead guilty, so the case went to trial. Because of the usual bureaucracy of the American judicial system, the trial did not begin until a year later. The prosecution summoned Dale's other cellmate to testify. According to him, the man confessed to him about Lisa's murder and told him all the details. The young woman allegedly saw him on the side of the road, stopped, and agreed to give him a ride. At one point, Dale began to molest her, but was rebuffed. Then he pulled out a gun and ordered her to his house, where he held her for several days and then killed her. But no one believed this version. Lisa's parents said she would never stop at night in the middle of nowhere to take a hitchhiker. Either Dale lied to his cellmate or he made up the story himself to reduce his sentence for testifying. So he clearly had a motive to lie. According to the investigation, that's not what happened. Most likely, Lisa stopped at a gas station, and that's where Dale attacked her. They even named a specific gas station between Casper and Dale's house. Lisa had to drive past it on her way to Cody. Dale himself often drove there to use the public restroom and sink, since he had no water on the property. Most likely, he got into her car and used a gun to force her to drive to some remote location, then brought her back to his station and held her in the bus. A few days later, he decided to get rid of her, took her to that bridge, stabbed her several times, and dumped her in the water. Experts also compared the handwriting of the note left on Lisa's grave with Dale's. They found a high similarity, but it was hard to call it evidence in court. Regardless, the DNA evidence on the body and the car on Dale's property was enough to convict him. Even the attorneys understood this, and they tried to avoid the death penalty for their client rather than a complete acquittal. They pointed to the mental abnormalities that made him unable to take full responsibility for his actions, but all was in vain. The jury found Dale guilty, and as a result, he was sentenced to death. Lisa's parents then filed a civil suit against him, which was granted by the court. Dale was seized from the land with the buildings on it and gave it all into the possession of the young woman's parents. Those, along with the fire department, burned all these structures to the ground on Lisa's birthday. Since the conviction, Dale's attorneys have filed numerous appeals to overturn the death penalty, which have always been rejected. But in 2010, the court did accept the appeal and set a new hearing. The appeal was accepted on the grounds that in imposing the sentence, the court failed to consider the offender's severe childhood, mental disabilities, and developmental delays. In addition, lawyers latched on to Dale's cellmate's testimony. The jury was not warned that the man had been promised a reduced sentence for this, so his testimony may well have been made up. Despite all this, there is no question of a complete reversal of the sentence. Dale is still in prison and is currently 78 years old, so the death penalty is unlikely to take place. There is one more point worth mentioning in this whole story. There have been several murders and strange disappearances of young women in the area where Dale lived, which have not yet been solved. The police have no evidence on hand, but they admit that Dale could have been the killer. His entire biography indicates that he is clearly prone to serial crimes, so Lisa Kimmel might not have been his only victim. Amy Blount was born on October 1, 1969, in Homestead, Florida. She grew up in a loving family and had many friends, largely due to her cheerful and kind nature. When she was 14 years old, her father passed away. Despite this painful loss, Amy found the strength to maintain a positive outlook on life. After high school, she enrolled at Flagler College, located in St. Augustine, near Jacksonville. Although it was home to only 13,000 people, it was the oldest city in the USA. It was founded by Spanish explorers, so many architectural elements still differ dramatically from the familiar American things. Amy loved studying at college, and in 3 years, she made many friends there. By that time, she was 21 years old and had only a little left before graduation. On November 6, 1990, her friend Kim came to St. Augustine, and they decided to go to a local bar popular among students. Amy's roommate and best friend, Kelly, also went with them. The young women had a great time enjoying the long-awaited meeting. At some point, their mutual acquaintance, Sean Nolan, joined them. He and Amy had mutual sympathy, but they were not in a relationship. In the evening, Kelly said that she felt sick and went back to the dorm, and a little later, Kim also left, leaving Sean and Amy alone. The next morning, the young women had to go to classes. However, when Kelly woke up, she found that Amy's bedroom door was wide open. She was not there. It seemed strange to her, but she decided that she would see Amy in class. However, the young woman never showed up. Kelly and Kim were worried about her absence and decided to talk to Sean, who stayed with her at the bar the night before. The guy worked at a place near the college, and the young women went to see him. His story seemed strange to them at first. He said that he had had a strong hangover and it was difficult for him to remember the chronology of that night. After gathering his thoughts, he finally told them that after the bar, he and Amy went towards the beach to take a walk, but soon they decided to go home. The guy called a taxi from the nearest payphone, and while they were waiting for the car, he and Amy had an argument. In the end, she went on foot to the dorm, which was only a few minutes away. Kelly was upset that the guy left Amy alone and didn't walk her to her dorm. At the same time, she became even more worried. Amy had nowhere else to go but the dorm, but she never showed up in her room. Her friend was afraid that something bad had happened to her and began to seriously suspect Sean. His strange behavior only heightened her anxiety. It seemed like the guy was not at all worried that Amy had disappeared. Kelly decided to continue her search and went to the university campus, asking all her acquaintances if they had seen Amy. The answer was the same. No one had met her that day and no one knew where she could be. At around 6 p.m., her friend decided to call the police. She informed investigators about the young woman's disappearance, and they began to check the information. They called all local hospitals, but no one resembling Amy had been admitted. The taxi operators were also contacted, but none of the drivers had picked up the young woman. That night, the police could not find any evidence that Amy had been in trouble or become a victim of a crime. Moreover, at the time, the young woman was already 21 years old, so they did not officially declare her missing, despite her friend's requests. By that time, Kelly was 100% sure that something bad had happened to Amy. Realizing that she could not convince the police to start searching, she decided to call Amy's mother. Later, the young woman admitted that it was the hardest call of her life. The next morning, Amy's sister arrived in St. Augustine to participate in the search. The first thing they did was go to the police station, where they received the same response. They couldn't start an investigation because there was no indication of a threat to life. The investigators believed that the young woman had simply left for a couple of days without warning. So the sisters, along with Kelly and other friends of the missing young woman, decided to organize their own search operation. They printed flyers with information about Amy and began posting them all over the city. Soon, a local television channel came to their aid, spreading information about the young woman's disappearance. All of this led to a large number of volunteers offering to participate in the search. They split into groups and began combing both the city and the surrounding area. Volunteers searched forests, beaches, abandoned houses, but they were unable to find any clues. This continued for 3 days until the police finally decided to start an investigation. By that time, the whole town was talking about Amy's disappearance, apparently putting pressure on the local police department and forcing them to take action. The first thing they decided to do was to talk to Sean, as he was the last person to see Amy, and here they encountered the first suspicious moment. The guy told them a story that was different from the one Kelly and Kim heard. Sean said that he and Amy left the bar and headed towards the beach, but on the way, they decided to split up and go home. He approached the payphone and called a taxi, but when he turned around, Amy was nowhere to be seen. After waiting for some time, he got in the taxi and went home. Investigators found this story strange. How could a young woman disappear from the street in a matter of seconds, and Sean, who was standing a meter away from her, not notice? Moreover, why did he give his friends a different version of events? All of this was enough to start considering Sean as a suspect. Detectives decided to verify his story and find the taxi driver who was supposed to take him home that night, and soon they succeeded. The only problem was that his story also differed from the two versions told by Sean. The driver claimed that he did indeed pick up the young man near the phone booth. However, when he arrived at the location, Sean was sleeping on a bench and the taxi driver had to wake him up. There was no young woman present at the time. On one hand, this provided the boy with an alibi, but on the other hand, he had, for some reason, shared his version of what had happened, which only raised suspicion with the detectives. Despite this, there was no evidence against him, so the police continued to search for new leads. 10 days had passed since Amy's disappearance. During that time, there had been no activity on her bank accounts, which only confirmed that she had not left on her own initiative. By that time, the residents of St. Augustine and the police began to suspect that Amy's disappearance might be related to another series of gruesome crimes, which we have a separate video about. In August of the same year, an unknown maniac killed 5 students in the city of Gainesville, which was 120 kilometers away. People began to fear that this criminal had moved to their town and that they were all in mortal danger. Investigators contacted colleagues from Gainesville and began to compare the cases, but soon they realized that there were many inconsistencies. The Gainesville killer attacked students in their homes and left their bodies there. In Amy's case, the police didn't even know if she was still alive and what had happened to her. Furthermore, at the time of her disappearance, the police had already arrested a man who was highly likely to be the killer. Several serious pieces of evidence pointed to him. Therefore, soon the detectives stopped looking for a connection between that series of crimes and Amy's disappearance. Meanwhile, the police department offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that would help find Amy. They immediately received hundreds of tips, but most of them led nowhere. This happens in any case where authorities offer money for information. People come up with various stories, hoping to get an easy check. It was also about 6 potentially important leads. Witnesses reported seeing her in different parts of the city. Many of them added that she got into some cars. Out of all this, one call was much more interesting. A man reported seeing Amy in the city center on the night of her disappearance. A fairly old car, similar to a Chevrolet Camaro, pulled up to her. There were 2 men inside. After a brief conversation with them, Amy got into the passenger seat and they drove off. At that time, this was the most detailed lead in the hands of detectives. However, something in the witness's behavior made them suspicious. After the call, he agreed to come to the station, answered all the questions, and tried to help. But for some reason, the investigators treated him with suspicion. Detectives called it a police instinct and couldn't explain their doubts. They offered him to take a lie detector test to verify his testimony, and the man agreed. They asked him only 2 questions: whether he had anything to do with Amy's disappearance and whether he could take detectives to her. The witness answered negatively, and the polygraph operator did not detect any signs of lying. Thus, investigators understood that they finally had honest testimony that could help find Amy. The police began searching for all cars that fit the witness's description, establishing the identities of the drivers and checking their alibis for the night of the young woman's disappearance. All of this continued for several weeks, but the detective never managed to find a single potential suspect. Since then, there have been no leads in this case, but on January 1st, 2 months after Amy's disappearance, a disturbing call was made to the police. A man was walking his dog on the outskirts of St. Augustine. At some point, his dog noticed a pile of logs with bricks and started acting strangely, barking and pulling on the leash, trying to run there. The owner decided to see what had so upset his dog and was almost speechless when he saw a skeleton hand sticking out from under the pile. He immediately called the police, and investigators began to extract the body. Due to the high degree of decomposition, they were unable to quickly establish her identity, but one detail immediately caught their attention. The body was wearing a green shirt, just like Amy Blount on the night she disappeared. The body was wrapped in a sheet. Medical experts conducted a more detailed analysis and concluded that the deceased was a young woman. She had received 5 sharp object wounds indicated by cuts on her shirt. In addition, 2 serious abrasions were found on the body. Investigators suspected that the victim was Amy, so they immediately sent her dental records to experts, who soon confirmed that it was indeed her. Friends and relatives of the young woman were devastated by the news. They had hoped until the very end that Amy would return to them unharmed. Now the police had to investigate her murder. Along with the discovery of the body, they received their first lead. Amy had been partially buried and covered with logs on the outskirts of a large private property. Upon learning the name of the owner of this plot, they called him in for questioning. For understandable reasons, the man immediately became a suspect. However, after talking to him, the investigators began to doubt his involvement. First, it was a huge plot of land without a fence, and anyone could enter it. Secondly, there were 2 residential trailers on the property whose owners paid the landowner for rent. He added that he constantly had problems with one of the tenants. When they heard his name, the police were shocked. It was the same witness who had been polygraphed. The man was 22-year-old Timothy Getchell. The police immediately asked the trailer owner to let them search the residence while the man was not at home, and he agreed. The first thing the police saw was a sheet very similar to the one in which Amy's body was wrapped. Upon further search, they found long female hair stuck in the mechanism of a floor exercise machine. It was the same color as Amy's hair. In addition, using special chemicals, forensic experts discovered blood traces in the living room. A sheet of paper with the name Toby and a phone number was also found in the house. The landowner said that a guy with that name did often visit Timothy. The police allowed that this person might also be related to the murder and contacted him. Toby agreed to meet with the detectives and told them his story. According to Toby's words, on the night of Amy's disappearance, he and Timothy were driving around town, stopping at different bars. At some point, they saw Amy walking alone on the street. Timothy asked Toby to stop the car, got out and approached the young woman. He invited her to join them and she got into the car. Together, they went to Timothy's trailer and had a party. However, Toby's story started to sound strange, like a detective story. At first, he claimed that he just dropped off Amy and Timothy near the trailer and immediately left. Then he changed his version and said that he went inside with them, had a beer, then went to the bathroom and left immediately without going into the living room and got into the car and left. Investigators doubted that he was completely honest with them. They didn't believe that Amy would go to the outskirts of the city with 2 unknown men at night. In the morning, she had to go to classes and was supposed to go to the dormitory right after the bar. It looked like Toby constructed his story in such a way that he couldn't be made an accomplice. Detectives did not rule out that Timothy and Toby might have actually abducted the young woman on the empty night street, but could not prove it yet. Moreover, Toby told something else. According to him, in the first week of the investigation, he saw flyers about Amy's disappearance and recognized her. Then he asked Timothy what happened that night. He claimed that he took the young woman to the city center and dropped her off there. After that, she approached another car and soon got into it. Toby told him that he should share this information with the police. Despite the fact that his story raised serious doubts, the police had enough evidence to arrest Timothy. They arrived at his house and the man came out with his hands raised. During the interrogation, he told the investigators the same story. When Toby left, he began to flirt with Amy, but she rejected him. Then he got angry and decided to take her back to the city. Considering that he did not have his own car, he took the owner of the land's pickup truck and drove her to the center, where Amy allegedly got into another car. But the detectives immediately realized that this was a lie. At that point, they already knew that the rental pickup truck had 3 flat and worn-out tires for many months. The investigators immediately told him about it, and Timothy became nervous. The detectives asked him, "Did you kill Amy?" And the man replied, "I don't know. It seems so." From that moment on, he began to talk about the events of that night. According to him, he didn't remember much of what happened. At some point, he tried to kiss Amy, and the next thing he remembers is her holding a knife. He allegedly got scared that she might attack him, so he tried to take the weapon away from her. After that, Timothy didn't remember anything, as if he had lost consciousness. According to him, this had happened to him before. He had completely lost some memories. When he came to, he found the knife in his hand and Amy lying on the floor, showing no signs of life. Scared, he decided to get rid of the body. Timothy went to the shed for the shovel and started digging a hole. He then wrapped Amy in a sheet and buried her there, covering the grave with logs and bricks. After that, he prayed to God and went to clean up the blood in the room. With his confession in hand, Timothy was charged with murder. No evidence was found against Toby, so he was only used as a witness. On July 15, 1991, a trial was held where the man planned to defend himself and receive a lesser punishment. He wanted to make it look like self-defense and use the story of memory loss. However, everything changed when the prosecutor addressed the judge and requested the death penalty. Almost immediately after that, Timothy stood up and said he was ready to confess to first-degree murder if the prosecution would drop the death penalty in favor of life imprisonment. After some brief consideration, the court agreed to these conditions, and Timothy was sentenced to life in prison. Amy's relatives and friends supported this decision. They all harbored hatred toward the person who took her away from them and wanted him to spend the rest of his life in a prison cell. As for Toby, no charges were ever brought against him. Nevertheless, his story still seems suspicious, and I wouldn't rule out the possibility that he was directly involved in the murder. Timothy remains behind bars to this day. He is currently 53 years old. Angela Samoda was born on September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California. She was the youngest of 5 children. When she was 1 year old, her father died, and her mother raised them alone. After graduating from high school in 1982, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. She chose the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering, which was not the most popular direction for young women at the time. Because of this, Angela was one of the few young women in her class, but this did not prevent her from studying excellently and moving towards her chosen career. Angela also had many friends, and later she started dating a guy named Ben McCall. He was several years older than her and worked in a managerial position at a construction company. During the first few years of study, Angela lived in a dormitory, and during this time, she and her roommate Sheila became best friends. At some point, Angela decided to rent an apartment near the university and chose a residential complex 5 minutes from the campus. In addition, she got a part-time job to cover the rental expenses. On the Friday evening of October 12, 1984, Angela decided to go to a bar with her friends. The young woman also invited her boyfriend, but he had to go to work the next morning, so he declined. As a result, Angela went with her friend Anita and their mutual acquaintance named Russell. They visited several bars and had a great time, after which they decided to go home around 1 a.m. Since Angela hardly drank alcohol, she agreed to drive her friends home. First, they dropped off Russell near his apartment. Anita originally wanted to stay overnight at Angela's, but she planned to attend a football match early in the morning, so Anita asked to be taken to the dormitory. After that, Angela decided to stop by her boyfriend's house for a few minutes. She went in for a few minutes and then went home. Her apartment was just a few blocks away from Ben's home. After saying goodbye to Angela, he went to bed, but he woke up 10 minutes later from a call on his home phone. It was Angela on the other end, and her voice sounded very worried. At first, she just asked him to talk to her, which seemed strange to him. He could hear some noise in the background and tried to find out from her what was going on. Soon, she told him that some man knocked on her door and asked to use her phone and bathroom. Angela did not specify whether she let him in voluntarily or the man entered the apartment without her permission. She asked Ben, "Are there any convenience stores nearby with a payphone?" The guy looked up a suitable store in the directory and gave her the address. She repeated this information to the man and told Ben that she would call him back soon and hung up. But the call never came. Ben waited for a few minutes, then started calling her himself, but there was no answer. Then he got into his car and drove to her apartment. When he arrived at the house, he started knocking on her door, but there was only silence in response. Ben had a portable phone in his car that was given to him by the construction company. He dialed Angela's home number and walked back to her apartment. He heard the phone ringing, but no one answered. Then he thought that the young woman might have escorted the stranger to the convenience store with a payphone and decided to go there. But the salesperson said that no one had come to them, and Ben returned to Angela's apartment. He knocked on the door again and decided to call the police. It was almost half an hour before 2 policemen arrived at the house. Ben explained the situation to them and asked to open the door to Angela's apartment. But the officers did not rush to take any active action. They decided to contact the manager of the residential complex and ask him for a key before entering the apartment. The first thing the police officer saw was a shoe on the floor in the middle of the living room. Then they headed to the bedroom, where they saw a horrifying sight. Angela was lying in bed, surrounded by a lot of blood, and she was not wearing any clothes. The police officers immediately noticed multiple stab wounds on her body. Later, experts counted 18 injuries. Investigators started examining the crime scene and noticed several bloodstains in the bathroom, presuming that they could belong to the attacker. In addition, several fingerprints were found in the apartment, but they did not lead to any results. Detectives also determined that the perpetrator had taken a kitchen knife, which was presumably the murder weapon. There were no signs of a break-in, indicating that the victim had let the attacker in, which matched Ben's story about the strange phone call. Medical experts determined that the victim had been assaulted, and they were able to extract biological material from the attacker. Unfortunately, DNA analysis was not yet conducted in 1984, so the experts were only able to determine the attacker's blood type. Investigators began searching for a suspect, exploring all possible lines of investigation. First, they looked into all the employees of the residential complex who could have had access to the apartment. They then looked into men who had previously been convicted of violent crimes and lived in the area, but this also did not yield any results. Next, they focused on Angela's acquaintances and first interrogated her boyfriend. He told them about the phone call and the unknown man who came to see Angela. However, the detectives did not immediately believe him and considered the possibility that Ben may have killed her and made up the story. Nevertheless, the boyfriend agreed to provide his fingerprints and a blood sample. The experts determined his blood group, which did not match the killer's blood group. After talking to the victim's friends, the investigators identified another suspect, her ex-boyfriend, who she had dated in her hometown. According to her friends, he sometimes behaved aggressively and once even threatened her with a knife. His blood group did not match the killer's blood group, and he was no longer considered a suspect. The next suspect was Russell, who had spent time with Angela a few hours before her death. And here, the police received their first alarm. They could not locate him on the day after the murder. Digging deeper, they found out that on the morning of October 13, Russell attended a wedding of acquaintances after which he flew to another city to visit relatives. When he returned home the next day, he was taken to the police station for questioning. The young man insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder, but investigators doubted his sincerity. Russell lived alone and couldn't confirm that he was in his apartment that night. Additionally, detectives learned that Russell had a crush on Angela. He was several years older than her and worked as an architect. They met through mutual friends shortly before her death, and Russell tried to ask her out on a date, but she told him she had a boyfriend, and they continued to communicate as friends. Detectives were also suspicious of the fact that Russell left town almost immediately after the murder. Given all of this, he quickly became the prime suspect. However, there were discrepancies in the new version of his involvement. According to Ben's story, an unfamiliar man came to Angela's apartment and was most likely the killer. Considering the timeline of events, no one else could have killed her and left the apartment. However, detectives did not base their investigation solely on Ben's story, as they simply could not confirm it. In the following weeks, Russell was called in for questioning repeatedly, and each time investigators became more convinced of his possible involvement. Some detectives even privately spoke with near certainty that he was the killer. Sheila, Angela's best friend, was deeply affected by the news of her death. She was so afraid to be alone that she had to move in with her parents, and for the first month after the murder, she even slept in the same room as them. At the same time, she almost constantly followed the progress of the investigation, constantly calling detectives and meeting with investigators. Sheila told them about Angela's friends and acquaintances, hoping to help get to the truth. During one of these meetings, a detective told her that Russell was most likely the killer, but they didn't have enough evidence to hold him accountable. He then asked Sheila to meet with him and ask him a series of friendly questions, such as, "What were you doing a few days before and after the murder?" Investigators wanted to verify if his story matched what he told them. A hidden microphone was attached to Sheila before the meeting. The young man told Sheila the same story, but the detectives didn't plan on giving up. They called him in for questioning again at the station and offered to conduct a polygraph test. Russell agreed and successfully passed it, but the investigators continued to consider him the murderer. They were so convinced of their rightness that during the interrogation, they showed the boy photos of Angela's body, hoping that this gruesome sight would break him. But all of this yielded no results, and Russell continued to insist on his innocence. After 6 months of constant questioning, he hired a lawyer and refused to communicate with the police personally. After that, detectives placed him under round-the-clock surveillance, but eventually had to switch their attention to searching for other suspects. Russell left for London to receive additional education in architecture, and the investigators lost the ability to monitor him during all that time. The Angela case was actively covered in the media, and her relatives offered a reward of $10,000 for any information that could help find the killer, but this also yielded no results. During the investigation, the police had another suspect, a student at the same university as Angela. Investigators received an unconfirmed lead that this guy allegedly had a crush on the young woman and wrote her angry letters a few weeks before the murder. However, the detectives were unable to confirm any of this, and the young man had a reliable alibi. Since then, the case remained unsolved for many years, with no new leads appearing for the police, and all the old leads leading nowhere. After 10 years of silence, Sheila decided to call the police station and inquire about the progress of the investigation. By that time, she had already gotten married and had 2 children. Despite the fact that her life continued, she could not forget the tragic fate of her best friend and the fact that the guilty party still had not been punished. She spoke with the detectives, but they said that there had been no developments in the case. Sheila asked, "Have they tried to extract DNA samples from the killer's biological material?" After all, it was already 1994, and DNA analysis technology was actively used by the police. However, investigators stated that the evidence in this case had been lost and could not be recovered. Sheila was not satisfied with these answers and continued to regularly call the detectives. Over the course of several years, she made over 700 calls, but each time she received generic responses. She even tried to independently pay for DNA analysis of all remaining evidence in a private laboratory, but was not allowed to do so. The problem was that she had no connection to the police and was an ordinary citizen, so her initiative was not taken seriously. Then, Sheila came up with an idea. She thought about obtaining a private detective license. In her opinion, this would allow her to have more useful influence on the course of the investigation, and she began to study this issue. The woman began to study hard, and after several months, she successfully passed the exam and obtained her license. Despite this, she was unable to convince the investigators to reopen the case. She continued to make regular calls until July 2006, when Angela's case was transferred to a new unit specializing in unsolved murders. Sheila met with the chief detective and they began to work on the case together. To her surprise, she learned that the DNA sample from the victim's body had not actually disappeared and had been in the laboratory all these years. Apparently, she had been intentionally lied to because she had tired the investigators with her calls. Sheila convinced the new detective to send the DNA sample for analysis, and it finally happened. However, due to queues and bureaucracy, they had to wait almost 2 years for the results. On February 14, 2008, the detective received the DNA profile of the killer and entered it into the FBI database. He immediately saw a 100% match, and after 24 years, they had the killer's name. When the detective called Sheila and told her about it, she expected to hear that Russell was the killer after all. But to her surprise, the detective gave her an entirely unfamiliar name. The DNA from Angela's body matched the sample of a certain Donald Andrew Bess. The man, who was already over 60 at the time, was in prison for a series of rapes. In 1977, Donald abducted a young woman and subjected her to violence, for which he received 25 years in prison. As is often the case, he was released early. He was released from prison after 7 years in the beginning of 1984, when he was 36 years old. In that same year, he killed Angela and remained unpunished for decades. In 1985, he assaulted another woman and was caught by the police. The fact that he was on parole at the time of the crime became an aggravating factor, and Donald was sentenced to life imprisonment. Thus, he ended up in prison a year after Angela's murder. After gathering all the necessary information, detectives came to the correctional facility to conduct an interrogation. Donald denied his involvement in Angela's murder and insisted that he had never harmed women. Of course, the investigators were not quick to believe him, as his semen was found on the victim's body. But the man was not eager to give a confession, and the case began to be prepared for trial. The start of the trial had to be postponed due to serious health problems Donald had. A few days before the hearing, he had a heart attack. As a result, the trial began only on June 2, 2010. Donald continued to insist that he had not killed anyone, but the DNA test results spoke for themselves. His lawyer tried to emphasize his health problems and good behavior in prison in order to secure a lighter sentence for Donald. The prosecution, in turn, asked for the death penalty. According to the investigators, Donald noticed Angela in one of the bars or on the street, after which he began to follow her. When she arrived home, he knocked on her apartment door and asked to use the phone and the toilet. After the young woman called her boyfriend and hung up, Donald attacked her and assaulted her. Detectives believe that the criminal was still in Angela's apartment when her boyfriend arrived and started knocking on the door, and Donald may have been afraid that his victim would scream. So he inflicted multiple stab wounds. After waiting for her boyfriend to leave, he left the apartment. The trial was heavily covered in the news, and this led to some unexpected consequences. Several women immediately went to the police and said that Donald Bess had subjected them to violence at different times. One of them was his ex-wife, who told the court about constant beatings from Donald. He raised his hand on her even when she was pregnant with his child, and after the birth of their daughter, he continued to physically abuse her. The wife had to run away and hide, fearing for the life of her child. As a result, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Angela, and he was sentenced to death. He attempted to appeal the court's decision several times, but failed. Donald spent 12 more years in prison, and during that time, his execution date was never set. However, in October 2022, he died a natural death. Another heart attack proved fatal. Thus, this complicated case came to an end. Investigators acknowledged that Sheila played a crucial role in moving the investigation forward by not giving up in her pursuit of the truth. After her story was publicized, relatives of other victims whose cases had gone unsolved for years began to reach out to her. As a result, Sheila decided to help these people and established a non-profit organization. Regarding Russell, the police department officially apologized to him for the months of persecution. He admitted that it had significantly affected his life, and he was genuinely afraid of being convicted of a crime he did not commit. Despite this, he continued to try to help the police get to the bottom of the case. After all of these events, he became a well-known architect in Dallas. One aspect of the story that still troubles investigators is the possibility that Donald may have had many more victims, even though he spent half of his life in prison. Perhaps, sooner or later, they will be able to link him to other crimes. Lynette Joy Dawson was born on May 5, 1948, in the Australian state of New South Wales. She grew up in a large, loving family with 2 brothers and a sister. Together with her parents, they lived in the small town of Clovelly, which is essentially a suburb of Sydney. Lynette was a cheerful child, had many friends, and always tried to help her loved ones. Her parents decided to send her to Sydney Girls High School, believing it would be the best choice for her. The school often held events in conjunction with Sydney Boys High School, and in 1965, at one of these events, Lynette met a boy named Chris Dawson. They were both 16 years old, and soon the couple began dating. After finishing school, Lynette decided to pursue a career in medicine. She wanted to help people, so she chose to become a nurse. At the same time, she took a part-time job at a child care center. When Chris and Lynette were 21, they decided to get married. The couple got married in 1970. The newlyweds moved to the northern suburb of Sydney called Bayview, where the woman got a job at a local hospital. Chris was actively involved in sports and played professional rugby since 1972. He had a twin brother named Paul, with whom they were in the same sports team. Later, they both decided to end their professional careers and became physical education coaches at one of the Sydney schools. Chris and Lynette dreamed of a large family, but they struggled to conceive for a long time. After 6 years of unsuccessful attempts, they began to consider adopting a child from an orphanage. But Lynette finally became pregnant, and the couple had their first daughter, followed by their second. Lynette and Chris were happy to finally have children. Their family seemed exemplary to friends and acquaintances, But soon, the first signs of trouble began to appear in this idyllic picture. Lynette's friends started to notice bruises and injuries on her body periodically. When asked about it, Lynette claimed that it was nothing serious and her friends shouldn't worry about it. Lynette's friends were concerned for her, but they didn't see what was happening as something truly terrible. In those days, domestic violence wasn't considered a serious crime in the eyes of a significant portion of society in Australia. Moreover, everyone who knew Chris considered him a loving husband and caring father who never showed signs of aggression and was a positive person. Therefore, their friends tried not to interfere in their marriage and hoped that the couple would solve their problems. But the relationship between Lynette and Chris only continued to deteriorate. Lynette noticed that her husband had cooled towards her and was worried about the future of their family. A few years after the birth of their daughters, they decided to use the services of a nanny. Chris suggested this job to one of his 15-year-old school students, Bev McNally, but she didn't stay in this part-time job for long. She witnessed Chris raising his hand to Lynette twice and decided to leave. After this, Chris offered this job to another of his 16-year-old students, Joanne Curtis. After some time, Joanne had problems in her family, and Chris offered her to stay with them for some time, so she could spend more time looking after the children until the situation in her family improved. Despite her kindness and desire to help people, Lynette was against this. She was deeply concerned about the problems in their own family and didn't want someone else to be constantly present in their home. However, Chris insisted on it, and in October 1981, Joanne moved in with them. The young woman lived with them for about a month until Lynette discovered that her husband was sleeping with Joanne. It was a real shock for her and another blow to their marriage. She kicked Joanne out of the house but decided not to divorce Chris. Lynette wanted to keep their family together for the sake of their children, and she continued to love her husband despite his actions. Just a few months later, on December 3, 1981, Lynette faced yet another shock. Chris left her a note saying that he was leaving the family. He wrote that he would move to another city with Joanne and asked his wife not to portray him in a bad light to the children. Lynette was devastated by this news, but a few days later she was surprised again. Chris returned home because Joanne changed her mind about avoiding him in another city and asked to be taken back. Meanwhile, Chris spent New Year's Eve with Joanne, leaving his wife alone with the children. At that time, Joanne moved into Chris's brother's house, which was on the same street. Despite everything that was happening, Lynette wanted to keep their family together no matter what, so she decided to enroll in family therapy. Chris was against this idea, but she managed to convince him. She went to see the specialist right after New Year's, and it seemed that the therapy had a positive effect on their relationship. Chris started to spend more time with his wife and showed a desire to fix everything. On January 8, 1982, Lynette called her mother and told her that the family therapy was going well. They also agreed to meet with her and other relatives at the local beach the next day, and her mother thought that her daughter's speech sounded a bit unclear, as if Lynette was drunk. The woman explained that Chris had prepared some alcoholic drink for her. The next day, the relatives were waiting for Lynette on the beach, but she never showed up. They called her at home, and Chris said that he had driven his wife to the bus stop that morning. She was going to the store to return some clothes that didn't fit. However, she never returned home, and her relatives began to worry. In the evening, Chris called Lynette's mother and told her that his wife had contacted him by phone. She said that because of the problems in their marriage, she had decided to be away from home for a while and gather her thoughts. Her relatives thought that what was happening was strange, as they were aware of the problems that had been building up between the spouses for years, but they still couldn't imagine Lynette leaving her two daughters. She loved her children more than anything in the world and never mentioned considering the possibility of going somewhere. Days passed, but Lynette still didn't contact her family, which only added to their worry. On January 12th, Chris reported that Lynette had called her home phone and said that she was okay. Since then, he had spoken to her a few more times and told her relatives that she had been using her bank card. Despite this, her family continued to doubt that Lynette was okay. She didn't know how to drive and didn't take any items that she might need for living. She even left behind cash that was hidden in case of an emergency. 3 weeks later, Lynette's eldest daughter started first grade, as the school year in Australia begins in January, but Lynette missed this event, which caused even more concern for her relatives. They were practically certain that something bad had happened to her. While Chris said that she continued to regularly call home, and the last such call was at the end of January. Since then, Lynette hadn't been in contact. On February 18th, 6 weeks after Lynette left home, her husband went to the police. He filed a missing person report and expressed suspicion that amid all the problems in their marriage, Lynette could have joined some religious organization or even a cult. Her relatives denied such a possibility, as Lynette was not religious and didn't attend church. The police began a search, but they had absolutely no leads. Lynette's mother and other members of her family were certain that she would never leave home, abandoning her daughters, so they believed that she had been kidnapped or some other tragedy had occurred. Despite this, the police concluded that Lynette had indeed left home, as they had no evidence to the contrary. They tried to find her for some time and then stopped the investigation. Chris posted a message for Lynette in a local newspaper, calling for her to come home. He wrote that he loved her and was eagerly awaiting her call. He also called all of her friends, trying to find any information about his wife's whereabouts. Despite Chris's eagerness to find Lynette, he divorced her a year after her disappearance, and the next year he married Joanne Curtis, his former student and lover, who had moved in with him on January 10, 1982, a day after Lynette went missing. Joanne became the stepmother of Lynette's daughters, and Chris, not wanting to traumatize the children with the stories of their mother's disappearance, told them that Joanne was their real mother. Lynette's relatives were not happy about what was happening, but they couldn't do anything about it. They stopped relying on the police, as they had long ago stopped investigating due to the complete lack of leads. Moreover, they didn't even try to question all of her relatives and friends, and the case was abandoned almost immediately without a proper investigation. Chris and Joanne moved to Queensland with the children, selling their old house. Chris almost completely cut ties with his former wife's relatives, only occasionally calling her mother. Later, Chris and Joanne had a daughter. 6 years passed, and during that time, Lynette never contacted anyone. This continued until 1990, when something unexpected happened. Chris and Joanne divorced, and soon after that, Joanne contacted Lynette's relatives to pass on shocking information. She said that she had suspected her husband of murdering his ex-wife all this time. According to her, a month before Lynette's disappearance, Chris had talked about hiring a hitman to get rid of her. On the very day she disappeared, he told Joanne that Lynette had left forever and would never return. She also advised the police to search the backyard of the house where Lynette and Chris lived. In 1991, the police questioned Chris. He said that his ex-wife was just trying to tarnish his name and that he had nothing to do with Lynette's disappearance. He admitted that the woman was intentionally doing this to get custody of their daughter after the divorce. At that time, the court was deciding who would have custody of their child, and Chris's arrest would have been beneficial to Joanne. Police seized phones from Chris and his brother, but nothing suspicious was found. So investigators once again abandoned the case, considering Joanne's words dubious. The case remained dormant for another 9 years until 2000, when police decided to excavate the backyard of Chris's old home. But there was a catch. Due to insufficient funding, they only dug around the pool area. This area was chosen after police talked to the new homeowners. According to them, during the sale, Chris persistently asked if they planned to change anything exactly in this place. The only thing that the police managed to find was a torn pink cardigan. Investigators admitted that it could have belonged to Lynette and contained some evidence, but DNA analysis found no matches with Lynette. A year later, the case was once again brought to attention. This time, the deputy state prosecutor concluded that Lynette was killed by someone she knew. Police resumed the investigation, questioning her friends and relatives, but they failed to find any leads. Only in 2003, 2 years later, investigators publicly announced that they considered Chris a suspect. They wanted to charge him with murder, but it never happened. Due to the complete lack of evidence, the man could not be convicted. But investigators managed to find many witnesses who reported that Chris and his brother regularly had intimate relationships with their school students. However, no charges were brought on this matter, and as a result, the case stalled again. In 2006, Chris claimed that he saw his wife among the extras of a series filmed in England, but no one could find any evidence to support his words. In 2010, police announced a $100,000 reward for information about Lynette's disappearance, and 4 years later, they doubled the amount. Despite the large number of appeals, this did not bring any results, and they failed to find any reliable leads. In cases where a monetary reward is promised, there are always many people who want to earn some extra money. They are ready to make up any information just to get the money. In 2015, police dug up a section of Chris's former home trying to find his wife's body, but they were unsuccessful. The turning point in this case came in 2018 when a podcast about Lynette's disappearance was released and gained massive popularity in Australia. Arguments were presented in favor of Lynette's husband being responsible for her murder. The podcast was listened to by several million people, which led to a wave of public outrage. Australians accused the police of negligence and demanded that the culprit be punished. The podcast's author, Hedley Thomas, spoke to Lynette's relatives and tried to find new leads. Although he was unable to find any new evidence against Chris, the public outcry was enough to initiate a new investigation. As a result, on December 5th of that year, detectives arrested Chris for the first time on charges of murder. He continued to insist on his innocence and was released on bail before the start of the trial. The wait dragged on for several years. In 2019, he appeared before a judge and claimed that he did not kill his wife and that the trial should have started in 2020. But Chris's lawyers consistently delayed the process. They insisted that due to the widespread coverage of the case in the media, their client had a biased attitude towards him, so they demanded that they abandon the jury and conduct a trial where the judge would make the decision. In May 2022, this demand was approved and the trial finally began. Chris's lawyers insisted that there was not a single piece of evidence against their client, and all the charges were based on societal bias due to the podcast. According to them, the author presented his opinion in such a way that many believed in Chris's guilt and refused to adequately evaluate the situation. Despite the lack of direct evidence on the prosecution side, they built their case on a multitude of indirect factors. Relatives and acquaintances of Lynette, who had repeatedly seen signs of abuse on her body, testified in court, and Lynette had admitted to them that Chris was responsible. Their neighbors, who witnessed the man beating her, also testified in court. They recounted that the day before Lynette's disappearance, when she returned to family therapy, she had bruises on her neck. One of the key witnesses was Joanne, who revealed that as she grew older, she realized how unhealthy her relationship with Chris was. He became obsessed with her when she was only 15 years old. He would leave notes in her backpack at school and ask her out on dates. He was persistent and didn't take no for an answer, so the young woman felt like she had nowhere to turn. According to Joanne, Chris completely controlled her life. He told her what to wear, who to talk to, and what to do. He monitored her every move and couldn't stand it when things didn't go according to his plan. As a result, the woman concluded that the man could have easily killed his wife. According to the prosecution, Chris had wanted to end the marriage for a long time, but he would have lost part of his property and custody of the children in the divorce. So he decided to kill Lynette and stage her disappearance. In addition, he wanted to get rid of her so that she wouldn't interfere with his relationship with Joanne. Chris's lawyers, on the other hand, insisted that Joanne had made all of this up to intentionally slander her ex-husband. They also called several witnesses who claimed to have seen Lynette years after her disappearance. These testimonies became the mainstay of the defense, but there was no evidence to support their claims. The prosecution believed that these testimonies were simply fabricated, and that if Lynette was alive, she would have contacted her relatives and daughters over the years. As for the phone calls that Chris allegedly received in the first month of her disappearance, no evidence of their existence could be found. The prosecution argued that the woman was already dead at that time, and the man made it all up to convince Lynette's relatives that she was okay. In their view, Chris killed the woman on January 9th, drove her body in an unknown direction, and hid it. Because the police were negligent in their work in those years, no proper investigation was conducted, although the killer's motives were always obvious. The trial lasted for 10 weeks, and on August 30th, 2022, the judge found Chris guilty. A few months later, in early December, the sentence was announced: 24 years in prison with the possibility of applying for early release after 18 years of imprisonment. Considering that he will be 92 years old by then, Chris may simply not live to see that time. After the sentence was handed down, Lynette's relatives, including her eldest daughter, spoke. She no longer doubted that her father had killed her mother and said that his actions had destroyed her life. The woman demanded that her father confess where he had hidden Lynette's body so that the family could finally bury her. But Chris remained silent and looked at the floor while his daughter spoke. Despite the fact that almost 41 years have passed since Lynette's murder, her relatives still hope to find her remains. Chris, who is now 74 years old, continues to insist on his innocence, but even his own children do not believe him. Thus, one of Australia's most high-profile cases was solved, in large part, thanks to a podcast that drew the attention of millions of people to this unjust story. If the police had conducted a proper investigation from the beginning, the killer could have been punished immediately after the crime, not after 4 decades. Linda O'Keefe was born on May 24, 1962, in Newport Beach, California, USA. She grew up in a large and close-knit family. Her father was a machinist and her mother was a seamstress. Linda had 2 sisters, an older sister and a younger sister. Linda was fond of drawing, played the piano, and loved nature and animals very much. On warm summer days, she did not miss any opportunity to go out to the beach, which was only 800 meters from her home. The girl was also a Girl Scout and attended summer school. In July 1973, when Linda was 11, she went there almost every day. Usually, she rode her bicycle to school, but on the morning of July 6th, a piano teacher who lived a few houses away from the O'Keefe family agreed to give her a ride. After class ended at about 1:30, Linda used the school phone to call her mother. She asked to be picked up because she was without her bicycle that day. But the woman was working at home at the time and didn't want to be distracted, so she told her daughter to walk. Even though it was only a little over 2 kilometers from school to home, Linda didn't want to walk. After talking to her mother, she even cried, and the school secretary thought about giving her a ride home. But the woman needed to go the other way, so she gave up the idea. Linda came out of the school, sat outside the building for a while, and headed toward home. Her route should have taken no more than half an hour, but the girl was clearly delayed. At first, her mother did not think much of it. She thought Linda had met her friends and gone for a walk. But with each passing hour, she became more and more worried. By 6 p.m., her mother decided to call everyone she knew whose children lived nearby and might have gone out with their daughter, but none of them had seen Linda that day. When her father returned from work, the family decided to go looking. They drove all over the neighborhood, including the route Linda was supposed to take back from school. At that point, the parents assumed the girl had resented her mother for refusing to pick her up and was deliberately not going home. But when they still could not find her and it began to get dark outside, they decided to go to the police. Officers took a missing girl report and began their search. Meanwhile, her father and older sister went out again to comb the neighborhood in 2 cars, while her mother stayed home, calling dozens of people who at least, with the slightest chance, could see Linda. The search continued throughout the night. Police searched the streets and parks using search dogs and helicopters, but it was inconclusive. By morning, the police department had dispatched more officers to join the search, and local newspapers were already reporting on the massive operation involving the disappearance of the 11-year-old girl. At about 10:30 a.m., a bicyclist and her friend and son were riding through a park that was 9 kilometers from Linda's house. They headed there to observe the local fauna for the botanical circle. Father and child dismounted and headed toward the ditches to see frogs, but something else awaited them there. Noticing something light in the grass, the man walked closer and saw there a human body partially covered by water. In the morning paper, he had read about the disappearance of a girl who had been searched for all night by the police, so he immediately thought that the body belonged to her. In the next few minutes, the man and his friends ran out of the park, got into their cars, and rushed to find the nearest payphone to report their find. On the way, they encountered an officer who had been part of the search for Linda. Upon hearing their story, the police officer reported it and headed toward the location. The investigators instantly realized that the deceased was Linda O'Keefe. She was wearing the same clothes the girl had left for school, and her backpack was lying next to her. This, as well as the white dress worn by the girl, had been made for her by her mother. She was not wearing shoes, however, and they were never found near the body. Detectives proceeded to examine the crime scene. They found tire tracks on the ground near where the body was found, but no other clues. Medical examiners determined that strangulation was the cause of death. They determined that the death occurred between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Investigators understood that Linda had most likely been abducted shortly after she left school, which meant that the perpetrator had held her somewhere for about 12 hours. The victim was also abused, and experts found traces of DNA on her body. They were given to the laboratory for safekeeping since DNA analysis had not yet been performed in those years. With no serious leads on hand, the detectives set about looking for witnesses. They interviewed all of Linda's friends, school employees, and residents of the streets where the girl was supposed to walk home. Soon, it bore fruit. On her way home from school, the girl was seen by her friend, who noticed something strange. Linda was walking along the road, and at some point, a turquoise van approached her. He slowed down and continued to drive next to the girl, but her friend did not see further events because Linda and the van disappeared from her field of vision. Almost immediately, police were able to find 2 more witnesses. The 19-year-old girl and her mother were driving a car about 100 yards from Linda's school. At one point, they noticed the girl talking to the driver of the turquoise van, who had stopped next to her. It was about 1:15 p.m. The witnesses lived near the O'Keefe family and were well acquainted with them, so they were very surprised that Linda was talking to some adult male on the street and decided to watch what was going on. The passenger door of the van was open, and Linda was standing right in front of it. Apparently, she was talking to the driver, and at some point, the girl got into the car. Immediately afterwards, the van drove away, and the witnesses decided not to pay much attention to it. They thought that Linda had been picked up by a relative or acquaintance because they were sure that the girl would not get into a car with a stranger. After questioning the girl and her mother, investigators got a rough description of the driver. He was a white man between the ages of 24 and 30, with blonde curly hair and an elongated face. Unfortunately, the woman could not remember the license plate number or even the make of the car. Despite this, the story of the two women was the only solid lead in the case, so investigators put together an APB on the suspect and his car, based on the words of these witnesses. They were sent out all over California, but it was fruitless. The detective spoke with the woman a few more times, hoping they might be able to recall some additional details. At one point, they were even offered a hypnosis session, and they agreed. It only partially worked. The witnesses recalled a few additional facts about the suspect's car, but they were all too insignificant to help find the killer. Soon, the police were able to find another witness. A woman who lived near where Linda's body was found heard a woman screaming at about 10:30 p.m. She thought she heard someone yell, "Stop hurting me," but that voice cut off abruptly. Given that the girl died around the same time, the witness could have heard it. The detectives then received another interesting tip. On the morning Linda's body was discovered, the artist was painting a picture in that very park. Noticing dozens of police cars, he began to observe what was going on and realized that something serious had happened. At one point, he saw something that struck him as odd. Beside the police, there was a young man in the park, watching from the bushes. He was standing quite close to him, and the artist decided to ask him what was going on. The young man looked extremely worried and said that the police had found the girl's body, except that the man and the artist were standing far enough away from where the body was found and could not see any details. The detectives had a logical question as to how the man knew that it was the girl's body they had found. The artist described the man as a thin, white male between 18 and 24 years old, about 180 centimeters tall, with blonde hair and sideburns. This was close enough to what the two witnesses told police when describing the appearance of the van driver. As a result, investigators concluded that this man was the killer, that he had decided to watch the police that morning. Although the police had a fairly detailed description of the killer's appearance, finding him in the big city was quite problematic. 2 days later, however, something unexpected happened. Peter Wooten, 18, came to them and confessed to the murder. The young man lived near the O'Keefe family and was in the same class as the victim's older sister, Cindy. The news instantly spread through the town, shocking the residents. Police officers, who did not expect such a turn of events, questioned the boy for 7 hours and also searched his parents' home where he lived. After that, he was formally charged with murder. 3 days later, another unexpected twist awaited everyone. Investigators announced that Peter had been cleared of all charges and released. According to them, there were too many inaccuracies in the young man's confession, and the only coincidences in his story intersected with information that had appeared in the newspapers. Otherwise, he gave investigators knowingly false testimony, which contradicted the real evidence. Lastly, the two witnesses who had seen Linda with the van driver stated with absolute certainty that it was not Peter. They were both acquainted with the young man because they lived near him, so the women would immediately recognize him. As a result, the police concluded that the young man was simply trying to draw attention to himself by confessing to someone else's crime. Maybe the guy had some kind of mental problems, but he had nothing to do with the murder. After that, the detectives weren't left with a single solid lead. They kept looking for the van and its driver, combing the entire town. Even Linda's classmates participated in the search, despite protests from the police. Kids rode their bikes through the streets trying to find that same turquoise van, but all of that yielded no results. In the first month of the investigation, police questioned 175 people, combed every millimeter of the path from school to home, and asked the public for help. A few weeks later, they decided to release a rough sketch of the van's driver, but that also yielded no results. Initially, detectives were reluctant to do so because they feared the man might flee town, but every day they had to use more and more tools to solve the case. 2 months later, the police had a new lead. Another girl had been abused in the same neighborhood. An unidentified man had dragged her into his van, taken her to a deserted place, and after what he had done, let her go. Investigators immediately speculated that Linda's killer might be behind the crime, but there were inconsistencies. The assailant drove a white van, and description of his appearance did not match the data provided by the witnesses in Linda's case. Soon, the detectives were able to get a lead on the suspect. It turned out to be a 32-year-old trucker, and his guilt was proven. Witnesses said that he did not look at all like the man Linda was talking to, and the investigators concluded that this man had nothing to do with her murder. Since then, no significant evidence has emerged in the case, though detectives continue to work on it over the ensuing years. In 2001, 28 years after the murder, police sent DNA samples from Linda's body to a lab so they could extract a profile of the killer's DNA. They succeeded, but the man was not in the FBI database. This indicated that the killer had not been prosecuted in other criminal cases, or it was before the time when they started taking DNA from criminals. A few years later, experts tried to find his next of kin in that database, but failed again. However, in those years, it was almost impossible to do something like that because the tools of DNA analysis were far from what we have today. A breakthrough in this field of forensics around the middle of 2010, and the police had a new ability to find suspects. Investigators in Linda's case weren't left out either, and in 2018, they turned to a private lab called Parabon. Detectives received from them a portrait of a man based on the DNA of Linda's killer. This innovative technology, called DNA phenotyping, allows you to know different traits of a person's appearance with just a sample of their DNA. Specialists compiled 2 portraits at once, showing what the perpetrator might have looked like at the age of 20 and 60. Surprisingly, this portrait was very close to the accounts of witnesses who saw the suspect alive 45 years ago. Usually, in cases like this, police publish portraits in the media to draw public attention and reach out to those who may have known the man. But investigators in Linda's case did something no one had tried before them. On July 6, 2018, exactly 45 years after the murder, they posted a series of messages on Twitter on behalf of the victim herself. The series of 68 messages described the last day of Linda's life. The detectives presented this information as if she herself were telling the world what happened to her on July 6, 1973. The narrative began in the morning with Linda recounting her day at school, her resentment at her mother for not picking her up in the car, and the girl's journey home on foot. All of the facts from these messages were carefully selected by detectives to paint the most accurate picture possible of the day. The series of tweets ends with the fact that the search for her killer has so far been unsuccessful, at which point the police have published a portrait of the perpetrator on behalf of the girl. Now, 45 years later, I can speak again, and there is something important I have to tell you. There is a new lead in my case, a face obtained thanks to the DNA of the killer, which he left behind. This technology didn't exist in 1973, but now it can change everything. This approach instantly brought Linda's case to the attention of a huge number of people around the world. Police officers had shared information on old, unsolved cases on social media before, but a narrative from the victim herself was something new. The portrait of the killer himself was useless. It could only help solve the case if someone recognized the person and told the police. So the investigators needed to draw as much attention to these pictures as possible, and they did a great job. In total, more than 7 million people saw the series of tweets. The police received many tips and possible identities of the perpetrator, and detectives spent several months checking them out, but they were never able to find a suitable suspect. In spite of this, they were not going to give up, especially after millions of people were interested in Linda's case. The investigators again turned to Parabon, and this time, they asked them to try to find the killer's relatives through his DNA, something similar forensic scientists had already tried to do in the early 2000s. But back then, the necessary tools simply didn't exist. Almost 20 years later, the situation has changed. Parabon's experts were successfully finding people related to the owner of the DNA, and with this information, investigators could find the perpetrator. Work on finding Linda's killer began in August 2018. It took experts almost 6 months to get the first results. Using private DNA databases, they were able to find the killer's third cousin. For detectives, that effectively meant they were one step away from solving the case. All they had to do was research the man's family tree and come up with a suspect. But the experts at Parabon kept digging deeper, and soon they had an unexpected discovery. They found the killer's own DNA in one of the private databases. He had voluntarily uploaded his sample to a database that allows them to search for lost or distant relatives. As it turned out later, someone in his family had given the man the special genetic kit he needed to get into the database. 45 years later, police finally had a name of the killer: James Allen Neal. The man, who was 72 at the time, lived in another state, and in January 2019, detectives went to see him. Before they could arrest the suspect, they needed to get a sample of his DNA because a private database wouldn't have the weight the court needed. On January 29th, police set up surveillance on Neal's house and arranged with a garbage service to hand them anything the suspect threw out. After obtaining several items from which experts could take a sample of his DNA, investigators sent them to the lab and then continued to monitor James for the next 3 days. Unfortunately, forensics was unable to get a sample of the man's DNA, so the detectives needed to find something else. They soon had that opportunity. They observed the suspect as he sat in his car in the parking lot smoking. He then threw the cigarette butt on the pavement and drove away, and the police immediately picked up the evidence. This time, experts were able to extract a DNA sample, and it matched the DNA of the killer found on Linda's body exactly. This meant that it was James Neal who was the very perpetrator they had been searching for almost half a century. A few days later, detectives organized a press conference at which they finally announced the arrest of the suspect. James Neal was born in 1946 in Chicago, after which his family moved to California. His parents often beat and humiliated him and subjected him to violence, which caused him to behave aggressively from an early age. As a teenager, he committed various petty offenses, including breaking into other people's houses. After that, he dropped out of school and tried to get a job, but he never stayed in one place for more than a few months. It turned out that the man had an extensive criminal history. He was arrested more than 12 times for crimes of varying severity: theft, car theft, robbery, but almost every time he got off with minimal punishment and then went back to his old ways. At the age of 25, James married for the first time, and the couple settled in the suburbs of Los Angeles. Their home was a half-hour drive from the city where Linda lived, and 2 years after moving in, he killed her. James' wife was pregnant at the time, and the perpetrator himself was on probation for less serious crimes in another state. After that, he was cited several more times for theft and counterfeiting bank checks, and he also spent a short stint in prison for violating the terms of his probation. Upon his release from prison, James was caught by the police 3 more times for traffic violations. He divorced his first wife, with whom they had 2 daughters. He lived in different states for a while, but then returned to Colorado and married another woman in 1997. She had a child from her first marriage, and soon she and James had a daughter. After examining his background in more detail, detectives found that the man may have been involved in dozens of cases of child abuse, but he was never held accountable for what he had done. In 1995 and in 2004, Neil kidnapped 2 girls by driving up to them in his car. He abused them and then released them. In both cases, he was never proven guilty, so James remained free. Police later suspected him of at least 5 more similar episodes in which an unknown man in a car abducted girls from the street. In 2010, a girl who went to the same church as James complained about him. She admitted that the man, who was 63 years old at the time, had been molesting her for months. In all, the victim reported several similar episodes, and Neil confessed. The only thing that happened next was something incomprehensible. The case was somehow hushed up. The victim recanted her accusations, and the men went unpunished. James returned to his usual life, and for the next 9 years, he was not in the sight of police, until he was arrested for Linda's murder. When questioned, the man denied any involvement and said he had never kidnapped the girls. When shown a photo of Linda, he said he had never seen her, with the man adding that she looked like one of his daughters. Given that the suspect's DNA was clearly on the victim's body, the court should have found him guilty anyway. Nevertheless, investigators tried to get as much evidence as they could. They wanted to find out if James had a turquoise van, but could not find a single confirmation of that fact. However, this was quickly explained. At the time of Linda's murder, he was a worker in an apartment complex and had access to the service van. During the search of his home, investigators found several hard drives containing illegal materials. Similar photos and videos were also found on his smartphone. Something interesting was also found on his computer. It turned out that James had studied the history of violent criminals who had been caught through DNA analysis. Apparently, he was well aware that it was DNA that could help the police link him to various atrocities. Another surprising discovery awaited the detectives after James was examined before moving into his cell. He had a tattoo of Linda's name on his wrist. Investigators thought he had left a reminder of his victim that way. However, it turned out to be an eerie coincidence. James had gotten the tattoo long before the murder, and the police were able to confirm it. The trial was supposed to start a year after the arrest in February 2020, but it was postponed because of the pandemic. James continued to insist his innocence, but detectives no longer doubted that he had killed Linda. However, the case never came to trial. In May, James was admitted to the hospital, where he died 2 days later of lung cancer. He did not know about his illness before his arrest, and when it was discovered, it was too late to begin treatment. Thus, the half-century-old case was finally put to rest. Detectives still believe that James may have had many more victims, and they intend to keep investigating in that direction. Linda's parents passed away long before the police found the perpetrator. Her mother blamed herself for what happened throughout her life, as she refused to pick up the girl from school. Linda's sisters thanked the investigators for not giving up on the case and getting to the bottom of it. Their only regret was that their parents had not lived to see the day. Sarah Yarborough was born on June 12, 1975 in Portland. Her parents soon moved to another state, settling in the town of Federal Way. It is near Seattle and is essentially a suburb of it. Sarah also had two brothers and helped her parents take care of the younger one and was very close to him. From an early age, Sarah was involved in music and ballet. The girl always strived to do well in school so she could get into a good college. Because of her academic performance, she flew twice to New Zealand in the school program. Later, Sarah joined her school's cheerleading team. She also had a great many friends. She was a kind and non-confrontational person, trying to help anyone in need. On Saturday morning, December 14, 1991, when she was 16, Sarah gathered for an event with her cheerleading team. They were to gather at the school building where the bus would pick them up. She took her dad's car and drove to school, only Sarah got the time wrong. She thought the bus would pick them up at 8 a.m., when in fact it wasn't supposed to arrive until 9. All her friends gradually started arriving at the place, but none of them saw Sarah. Some students saw her car in the parking lot, but there was no young woman inside, not even when the bus arrived for the students. Her friends thought this was strange, but no one could contact Sarah because none of them had cell phones at that time. Around the same time, two 12-year-old boys were walking around the school grounds. Walking through the wooded area behind the school tennis courts, they noticed a strange man. He came out from behind the bushes, looked at them, and walked away in the opposite direction. He seemed strange to the children, but they did not pay much attention and walked on. Just a few meters away, a shocking sight awaited them. A young woman lying on the ground with no signs of life. Thinking she was dead, the school children ran home to tell their parents. While the parents of one of the boys went with him to the place, the father of the other decided to follow the suspicious man the children had seen. His son told him that he saw a car that looked like a Chevrolet Nova pulling away from that spot. Given that he lived near the school, his father decided to go outside and try to track down that car. At one point, he managed to locate a similar car, but it quickly disappeared from his sight and the man was unable to find it again. Meanwhile, the other boy's parents came to the school and realized that the young woman on the ground was probably dead. They immediately ran to the school building and called the police. Officers arrived on the scene and confirmed that the young woman was indeed dead. They were also quickly able to determine that the deceased was Sarah. From the marks on her neck, the officers concluded that the victim had most likely been strangled. Next to the body was some of her belongings, a jacket, underwear, and socks, with no other items near her. Officers found her purse and car keys inside the car in the school parking lot, leading them to believe that the perpetrator may have attacked her directly next to the car and then dragged her behind the trees. The body was turned over to medical examiners, and the police set about looking for clues. The first thing they did was try to interview all the people who were on and near the school grounds. The two guys who found Sarah gave a rough description of the man who had come out from behind the bushes near her body. They said he was a tall man in his early 20s with shoulder-length blonde hair, a dark raincoat, and black pants. Soon the police found another witness, and here a very surprising story awaited them. A man out for a jog noticed a strange picture in the same wooded area. A young woman was lying next to the bushes with a man hovering over her, and the young woman was not moving at all, and the witness thought that some couple had just decided to have some privacy. A few minutes later, he ran down the same road in the opposite direction, and the man and the young woman were still there. In both cases, it did not appear to him that he was watching a felony being committed. The witness himself explained to the police that he had only recently immigrated to the United States from another culture and was not sure what behavior was the norm in that country, but nevertheless, this witness gave the police a rough description of the killer, which matched the words of the children who discovered the body. Detectives interviewed several dozen other people who had been near the school, but no other useful leads were found. Meanwhile, medical experts examined Sarah's body and concluded that strangulation was the cause of her death. Apparently, the perpetrator used her own pantyhose. In addition, a serious injury was found on the young woman's head. The experts assumed that from this blow, the victim lost consciousness, which was consistent with the runner's story. He saw that the young woman on the ground did not move at all. Forensic investigators studied Sarah's clothing, and on almost every item, they found traces of male semen belonging to the same person. But in 1991, there was no common DNA database yet, so all the investigators could rely on was a direct comparison of DNA samples from specific suspects. There was another nuance that was brought to the detectives' attention. Even though forensic scientists found traces of male semen on Sarah's clothes, medical examiners stated that there were no signs of sexual abuse on her body. With all this information in hand, investigators formed their own view of what happened. Sarah arrived at the school almost an hour early, and there was no one in the parking lot but her. Her attacker most likely spotted her there, waited for the young woman to get out of the car, hit her on the head with an object, and Sarah lost consciousness. He then dragged her from the parking lot behind the trees, where her body would later be found. The perpetrator removed some of her clothing and performed lewd acts on her before strangling the victim with her own stockings. When one of the children who found Sarah's body told police about the car in which the perpetrator allegedly fled the scene, detectives put out a search for a Chevrolet Nova, and soon they were able to find her. But here they were disappointed. It turned out that the driver of that car had just been delivering donuts that morning. He provided his DNA sample, which did not match that found on Sarah's clothes. Apparently, the kids just saw the car that drove down the road next to them and thought the perpetrator was behind the wheel. In fact, none of the boys could recall exactly whether they saw a man approaching any car from the bushes. Over the next few days, police continued to search for witnesses and new leads, but no significant progress was made. On Monday, school classes resumed, even though all the students were horrified by what had happened. In addition to the fact that the murder had taken place only a few meters from their school, the perpetrator was still at large, and his identity remained unknown. The young women were afraid to walk the grounds alone, so the boys on the sports teams arranged to walk each student to her car or bus so they would not be left alone on the street. Detectives determined that there were about 70 potential witnesses in and around the school that morning, and they talked to each of them, but no new details could be learned. Based on the accounts of the two children and the jogger, a rough portrait of the killer was compiled and distributed to all local newspapers and television stations. The story received extensive media coverage, and over the following weeks, the police received hundreds of tips. Investigators checked every one of them, but in all cases, they hit a dead end. At one point, they received a tip about a man who matched the killer's description and had a criminal history. But here, the detectives had a setback. His DNA did not match the perpetrator's sample. Since then, the case has been stalled for many months. In total, the police received about 4,000 different leads, and they tried to work with each of them. But the resources of the local police department were simply not enough to cope with so much information. Time also played against them, even as the investigators continued to search for the perpetrator, and each month there were new cases to be investigated. When Sarah's family learned that the police didn't have enough resources to handle all the tips, her grandfather tried to help as much as he could. He worked for a technology company and convinced management to temporarily provide the police department with a very powerful computer worth $150,000. It was a colossal sum in the 90s, but management still went along with it. With this computer, police officers could store information about all the leads in one place, process them at an increased speed, and sort them in a convenient form for quick study. Despite all this, every lead led them down a dead end, and they made no progress in the years that followed. 2 years later, Sarah's classmates graduated, and before graduation they decided to memorialize their friend. They raised an impressive sum of money and spent it to create a memorial. It was a bench on which Sarah's things were cast in metal. Next to these things, there was also a picture of the young woman's dog reaching for her purse. Over the years that followed, the case was periodically reopened, re-examining all the available evidence, but the result was the same. They were still unable to get any closer to catching the culprit. During this time, the police interviewed several thousand people and took DNA samples from nearly 300 possible suspects, but all this was inconclusive. In 2011, 20 years after the murder, the new detective decided to enlist the help of modern technology. He heard about a company that began working in the field of genetic genealogy. The policeman contacted them and asked, could they try to locate relatives of the person who left his DNA on the victim's body? And the experts undertook the task. Unfortunately, they failed. First of all, in 2011, genetic genealogy was just gaining momentum, and the experts were very limited in their capabilities. For example, they have not learned to search for male and female relatives in one sample. If they had the DNA of a man, they could only look for family ties with other men and vice versa. Secondly, they had another obstacle in front of them in the form of various laws that prohibited the use of genetic data samples to search for relatives of suspects. Nevertheless, it bore some interesting fruit. For one thing, the team of researchers approached by the detective had already been working for several years to create a genetic pedigree of the first people who sailed to the United States from Great Britain in 1620 on the ship Mayflower. After studying the DNA of the killer Sarah, they discovered that the man was related to one of the ship's passengers, Robert Fuller. However, it was almost impossible to trace him through this chain, especially in those years. There were just over 100 people on the ship, but over the centuries the number of their descendants has exceeded 25 million, and secondly, the detectives had no idea that he had made the Sarah Yarborough case the first of its kind. Although his idea was not successful, it was the first crime that was attempted to solve with the help of genetic genealogy. The detective tried to use the information available and tracked down several men with the Fuller surname who were living in the area of his town at the time of Sarah's murder. He found photos of them and met the only witness, a jogger and 2 men who had found the body as children. Unfortunately, neither of them recognized the killer in the photo. Finally, the investigators asked for DNA samples from all Fuller in the area and sent them to the laboratory. None of them matched the DNA of the killer. But something interesting happened here. The experts established that one of those men was indeed a distant descendant of Robert Fuller from that very ship. However, he was definitely not the killer, and also did not know that any distant relatives lived near him. The perpetrator may have been so distantly related to him that their family simply never knew of the connection. The detective retired in 2017, and the case was turned over to a new team. Investigators revisited the company which had taken on the killer's DNA sample in 2011. By that time, the ability to study genetic material had advanced a great deal, and experts agreed to try to trace the perpetrator's lineage. It took 2 whole years. The experts used public databases to find even the most distant relatives of the killer. Then they manually tried to trace their family ties and reach people who lived in Federal Way at the time of Sarah's death. In all, they had to weed out several thousand people before they finally got lucky. Experts determined that a DNA sample from Sarah's clothes was highly likely to belong to one of the 2 brothers. At the time of the murder, one was 33 years old and the other was 27. The older one turned out to be a criminal with an impressive criminal record. He had been in prison for violent crimes, and his DNA sample was in the FBI database, which meant that he had nothing to do with Sarah's murder, because then his DNA would have shown a match back in the 90s. As for the younger brother, named Patrick Nicholas, he too has been on the police's radar for violent crimes, including crimes against minors. But that was before the DNA samples of such criminals were added to the database. Detectives immediately organized a surveillance of the man. The man, who was 55 at the time, lived in a neighboring town called Wellington. The cops had been following his every move for 2 days, and soon the opportunity presented itself. Patrick went to the laundry, and while he was waiting for his clothes to be washed, he went out to smoke and threw his cigarette butt on the ground. One of the cops immediately took it into an evidence bag and returned to his car. Patrick went out to smoke a second time, and this time a rag handkerchief fell out of his pocket. The men didn't pick it up and went back to the laundry room, and the police were happy to take the second piece of evidence in case the experts were not able to get a DNA sample from the cigarette butt. However, the experts were easily able to extract samples from all these items, and the very next day they told the detective the long-awaited news. Patrick's DNA was a perfect match to the semen found on Sarah's clothes in 1991. The judge immediately issued a warrant for the man's arrest, and the police took him into custody. It all took 5 days from when investigators first learned his name to the formal murder charges. When his biography was leaked to the media, many began to ask the perfectly logical question: why was a man with such a criminal history not even considered a suspect for all those 28 years? At age 19, Patrick Nicholas approached a young woman and got into her car where he tried to abuse her. The victim managed to escape, but to do so, she had to jump into the river and swim for a long time until she was a safe distance from the perpetrator. Patrick spent 4 years in prison, after which he was released. The next crime that the police caught him for was in 1994, when he tried to abuse an underage young woman. He was arrested again, but his DNA was not entered in any database. The reason for that is strange. The article he was prosecuted for was not hard enough to collect DNA, and the police never came across his name in 3 decades. He also didn't appear in any of the 4,000 leads obtained over the years. It also turned out why genetic genealogy experts could not trace him back to Robert Fuller. It turned out that Patrick's biological grandfather was adopted and grew up under the adoptive family name. One of the men who discovered Sarah's body as children in 1991 immediately stated that Patrick was without a doubt the killer. He admitted that the incident had had a profound effect on him. He was only 12 at the time the body was discovered, and the perpetrator had seen his face. For years, the witness was constantly afraid that the killer would come after him, and it was only after Patrick's arrest that he finally felt safe. Patrick's trial did not begin until 2023. The man insisted on his innocence, and his lawyer tried to challenge the main evidence, DNA. In his opinion, the presence of Patrick's semen on the clothes of the murdered young woman did not prove his guilt. But this argument did not work. The lawyer also tried to challenge the accuracy of the DNA analysis itself, but the experts declared the absolute invalidity of such claims. Patrick was eventually found guilty of first-degree murder without prior intent. On May 25th, he was sentenced to 45 years and 8 months in prison, virtually eliminating the possibility of ever getting out. During the pronouncement of that sentence, Patrick showed no emotion, unlike Sarah's relatives. They also spoke before the judge, thanking everyone involved in the trial and the investigators for bringing the killer to justice, even though he had managed to evade justice for 28 years. Alice Gross was born on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2000, in London. She grew up in a full, loving family. She also had an older sister. From an early age, the girl showed an affinity for creativity. She loved to draw and play the piano and violin. Later, Alice began to write her own gorgeous songs and perform them to her own music. In addition, the girl was fond of clothes design and at age 11 even made herself a dress, which she planned to wear at a school graduation. When the girl was 13 years old, doctors diagnosed her with anorexia and depression. Despite all of this, Alice continued to pursue creativity and had every chance of achieving tremendous success in the future. On August 28, 2014, Alice told her mother that she was going on an outing. She had school vacations and plenty of free time, so the girl loved to walk along a small water canal and river near her home. The family lived in a suburb of London called Hanwell, and her usual route was 4.5 kilometers. The girl went out at about 3 p.m., promising her parents she would return around 6 p.m. She later texted her father that she would be home soon, but Alice did not return at the appointed time. And when it was already 7 p.m. on the clock, her parents began to worry. They tried calling her, but her phone was off. The fact that Alice suffered from anorexia and depression only added to her anxiety. Her parents feared something might have happened to her. Because of her physical condition, she was constantly weak and could faint. Her parents called some of her friends in the hope that Alice might be with them, but no one had seen the girl that day, and her mother and father decided to call the police. They immediately began a search, and the first thing they did was to investigate the route Alice usually took. Her relatives and friends of the family also joined the search. Alas, they could not find any trace of the girl, but detectives were able to find several witnesses. Thanks to their testimony about the places where Alice had passed, the police were able to determine her route more accurately, which in turn allowed them to narrow the search area and select several street cameras that could have captured her. After examining the footage, detectives did locate Alice. Almost immediately after leaving the house, she was caught on the first camera, heading along the Grand Union Canal. A short time later, she was spotted in the Bryn Ford area, which was further down the canal. The last time the camera captured her was on her way back near her home. The girl was walking near the Trampers Way Bridge. The police also reported the missing teenager to the media, and they broke the news about the case all over London in the first hours after her disappearance. Thanks to that, detectives received several calls from witnesses who had seen Alice. Unfortunately, none of this brought the police any closer to finding the girl. Based on camera footage and witness accounts, she disappeared on her way home, having traveled most of her usual route. But what happened to her remained a mystery. 3 days went by as police continued to examine camera footage in nearby neighborhoods and surveyed local parks and other secluded areas. At the same time, patrol officers went door to homes along Alice's route and asked questions of local residents. On September 1st, The girl's relatives recorded a video message begging her to return home. They also asked anyone who had any information about her whereabouts to contact the police. At the time, investigators were considering several theories. The first and most troubling was the kidnapping version. Despite the fact that most of Alice's route was along city streets, there were many remote and hidden areas where the girl might have been attacked. In addition, the London police often encountered situations where people were kidnapped right in the center, let alone in the suburbs. The second was a theory about running away from home. Alice's parents feared that depression might have driven her to such a decision. They also didn't rule out the possibility that the girl might have taken her own life because of her illness, but to the police, this version seemed unlikely. At 14, Alice was unlikely to be able to run away and hide, especially without help, and if she had taken her own life, she would very likely have been found by now. The case attracted more and more public attention every day, and on September 3rd, it was handed over to a special unit of Scotland Yard. Although they usually only worked on homicides, the detectives rated the chance of getting the girl home as high. Scotland Yard organized a large-scale search, which was immediately joined by hundreds of volunteers. After seeing the heartbreaking appeal of her parents and sister in the news, concerned Londoners combed the area from early morning until late at night, and the next day detectives announced the discovery of the first tangible clue. They managed to find Alice's backpack, which contained her shoes worn that day. It was relatively close to her home. This find allowed the police to narrow their search, focusing on a small area near the canal. Investigators realized it was unlikely the girl had taken off her shoes herself, thrown them in with her backpack, and fled. She did not have a change of shoes with her, so the situation became more and more complicated. Scotland Yard decided to release all available surveillance footage of Alice. The backpack with the shoes indicated that the girl might be in serious danger. The main version was still an abduction, but the investigators did not completely rule out the possibility that the girl might have committed suicide. For that reason, they tried to use all available resources to locate her. The publication of the recordings might draw more attention among the public, and someone might remember seeing Alice that day. Along with that, several hundred more people from various agencies were involved in the search, and there were already 600 people working on the case. The investigation was thus the largest since 2005 in terms of the number of police officers involved. Some of them were directly surveying the area, while others were examining footage from hundreds of cameras that could have captured Alice. Scotland Yard also offered a £20,000 reward for any information that could help find the girl. Although police were unable to locate her phone, they asked the cell phone company for details of its last known location. It turned out that Alice had sent a message to her father from practically the same place where they would later find her backpack. Everything indicated that the investigators needed to focus on that particular location. The decision was made to conduct a thorough inspection of an area of several square kilometers. Every meter of land and water was examined manually. Police teams literally probed the river and canal bottoms for any evidence. 2 days after the discovery of the backpack, it became known that the police arrested a 25-year-old man on suspicion of Alice's murder. The next day, they arrested another man, but refused to comment on the situation until all the details were clarified. However, soon both suspects were released, and Scotland Yard stated that they were unable to establish the involvement of these two people in Alice's disappearance. More than a week passed, and during all that time there was no progress in the case. It was only on September 16th that the police made another statement. They said they were looking for a 41-year-old man named Arnis Salkans in connection with Alice's disappearance. He moved to England from Latvia 7 years ago. He lived in the area and worked as a construction worker. Scotland Yard became interested in him for two reasons that at first glance seemed unrelated. First, Arnes's co-worker reported him to the police about his disappearance as early as September 3rd. The man did not show up for work, did not answer his phone, and was not at home. It seemed as if he had simply vanished. Second, detectives found that Salkan's route from home to work was roughly the same route that the girl had taken the day she disappeared. All of this was not yet enough to draw any conclusions about the man's involvement in the girl's disappearance, but detectives soon discovered something really disturbing. In one of the camera recordings, they saw a middle-aged man riding his bicycle across the bridge where Alice had passed just a few minutes before. This man turned out to be Zalkan's. A short time later, he came to the next camera and here the detectives noticed a very strange moment. The journey between these cameras should have taken only a few minutes, and it took the man on the bicycle practically a whole hour to ride down this road. A reasonable question arose. What was he doing all that time on such a short stretch? The police investigated the area and concluded that he could not have taken the longer route to the next cell, because there simply was none. Even more disturbing was the fact that all this was taking place in the very area where Alice's path was allegedly cut short. The cops also concluded that the man's clothes were wet when he pulled onto the road. Continuing to study the cameras, detectives noticed Salkan's on his bicycle returning to the same location 2 hours later after riding back out 50 minutes later. In doing so, he was not caught on the camera located on the bridge. This indicated that the man had spent all that time inside a small blind spot. Besides, he was already wearing different clothes. About an hour later, he was caught on a camera of a local store buying beer. The next morning, the situation repeated itself. Salkan's returned to the same spot between the cameras at about 7 o'clock and also returned there again in the evening. All this was enough to get a search warrant for his house. It turned out that the man was living there with his girlfriend and their 2 daughters together. His roommate also had no idea where Salkan's had gone. When she learned that he was suspected of killing the girl, she stated that Arnes could never do something like that. She described him as a caring and loving father. Along with this, Scotland Yard examined the man's biography and discovered a truly creepy moment. It turned out that the Zalkans had a rich criminal past. In 1998, being in Latvia, he killed his wife in cold blood and calculatedly, having dug a grave for her in the woods, for which he got only 7 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he moved to England and the local law enforcement agencies did not even know about his criminal record in his home country. Police officers searched Zalkan's home and found a recently excavated plot of land on his property. They did not disclose whether they found any evidence there, but a significant find awaited them in the basement of their house. A broken back panel from a white iPhone 4S was found there. Alice had the exact same phone. After examining the contents of his computer, the police also discovered that the man had searched the internet for information about Alice Gross's disappearance a few days after the incident. On the basis of all this, Arnes Salkans was put on the wanted list. Scotland Yard feared that the man might have fled back to Latvia or another European country, so they searched all over the EU. But law enforcement authorities were unable to find a single trace of the suspect. Meanwhile, a month had passed since Alice's disappearance, and on September 30th, police issued a depressing statement. A human body was found in a river near the girl's disappearance. At the time, the identity was not yet known, but police shared one eerie fact. Someone had gone to great lengths to arrange for the body to remain underwater and not resurface. Only the next day, law enforcement authorities confirmed that the deceased was Alice Gross, though no one doubted it anymore. The scene was in the exact spot where she had disappeared. The cause of death was asphyxiation. It turned out that Alice's body had been wrapped in construction bags and tied to a large tree stump. In addition, the perpetrator made the whole structure out of a bicycle wheel and bricks, which also prevented the body from surfacing. She also had no clothes on except for one sock. Detectives paid a visit to the setup where Salkans worked and discovered that the same bags used to hide Alice's body were the same ones used at his construction site. After the discovery of the body, police continued to search for Salkans, working closely with Interpol and local European intelligence agencies, but they were still unable to find any trace of him. This went on until October 4th, when investigators made an unexpected discovery. They discovered the man's suspended body in a park just 1 kilometer from where Alice was murdered. 2 days later, experts confirmed that the deceased was Ernest Salkans. No one expected such a turn of events. The main version of Scotland Yard was the escape of the suspect to Europe, but in fact it turned out that all this time he was under their noses. Medical experts concluded that the man had committed suicide on the day of his disappearance, September 3rd, and that he could not be found for a month. Nothing surprising here, however. Salkans had chosen a very remote and hard-to-reach location where he was extremely difficult to spot. With Salkans' DNA in hand, investigators had even more evidence. Near where Alice's body was found, police found a cigarette butt, which was sent to a lab. Experts extracted DNA from the filter, which matched the Salkans sample. In addition, the lab said that it was highly likely that the perpetrator's DNA was found on the victim's body. They could not assert this with 100% certainty due to how long the body had been underwater. His DNA was also found on the girl's backpack and shoes. By that time, the police had discovered another gruesome fact. It turned out that 2 years after moving to England, Salkans had molested a 14-year-old girl just a kilometer away from where Alice's body was found. The man attempted some indecent act, but the victim survived and the man was arrested. This is where the fun part begins. The girl did not press formal charges and the perpetrator was simply released. It is not entirely clear how this could have happened, but the fact remains. An adult man molested a girl, fell into the hands of the police and escaped punishment. Moreover, information about this case surfaced after the perpetrator's body was found in the park. Despite all this, the police continued to investigate and it took them some time to put together a picture of what had happened. According to their version, on that unfortunate day, August 28th, Salkans was riding his bicycle along the same route where Alice was walking. Having noticed her in a secluded area, hidden from prying eyes, he attacked her in order to commit depraved acts. How events unfolded next, we shall never know, but the outcome was tragic. Salkans killed Alice and then hid her body in several approaches, constantly returning to the place. We will also never know why he decided to take his own life after what he had done. Whether this can be called a manifestation of conscience is very debatable. Alice's parents, who survived such a terrible tragedy, were outraged by the government's actions. They were perplexed how the British authorities allowed a convicted murderer to enter the country and stay here to live. They had spent years fighting for the government to increase its control over migrants and keep criminals out. Unfortunately, to this day they have been unable to make any serious changes. A month after the discovery of Salkans' body, another interesting event occurred. The medical examiner in charge of the investigation left a folder of case documents on the train. The 30 pages contained important information about the murder, including medical information and undisclosed details. The public, the media, and Alice's parents harshly criticized the police, but there was nothing they could do about it. However, No one tried to judge the deceased perpetrator anyway. The investigators said that if he were alive, they would have had enough evidence to bring the case to court, but there was no guarantee of a conviction. The problem was that all the evidence against Alkans was circumstantial, and he had a small chance of getting away with it. Instead, a hearing was held in court in which the jury admitted an already obvious fact. Alice had been murdered. Her death was not an accident. The procedure was formal and played no role. Alice's funeral was held on October 23rd. Thousands of people came out to the memorial that day. And at the end of the ceremony, a beautiful song that the girl wrote and sang herself was shown on the big screen.